Welcome back. In this episode, terrifying and disturbing stories are shared about park rangers who encountered creatures in the forest. Before it begins, a reminder to subscribe, like the video, and share it with friends and family. A special thanks to all who offer their support. Now the stories begin. He was dragging others into his nightmares, but he couldn't hold back any longer. For all these years, he'd replayed every detail like a film that refused to end. His name was Liam, and this had happened to him back in 2017 in Mount Hood National Forest in Oregon, a place he used to visit on weekends to clear his head and feel like he had his life somewhat under control. He grew up around the corner from a small lake in Michigan, so he learned to hunt at an early age. His dad taught him to respect the land and keep his aims precise. Even though he ended up in Portland, busy with a job in mechanical repair, his free time still revolved around heading into the wild with his rifle slung over his shoulder. He supposed he liked the predictability of hiking through tall pines and listening to the soft rustle of the underbrush. Nature rarely lied to him. It never sugarcoated anything or tried to impress. It gave him a sense of peace he couldn't find in the city. That year, he'd convinced his friend Owen to come along, figuring they both could use a breather from the daily grind. Owen had been complaining about his desk job for months, always talking about how the fluorescent lights made him feel trapped, how the endless meetings drained something vital from his soul. He'd never been much of an outdoorsman, but something lit up in his eyes when Liam mentioned the trip. He told Liam he needed this escape more than he was letting on. They arrived in early November when the air was crisp enough to see your breath in the morning. The sun peeked over the mountain ridges, lighting up the fir trees like a postcard. Everything smelled like damp wood and faint smoke from distant campfires. Owen brought along a small pop-up camper he'd borrowed from his cousin, so they set it up near a winding creek off a rarely used trail. The Forest Service map showed their location as being several miles from the main camping areas, marked with thin dotted lines that indicated primitive access only. Liam preferred it that way. The quiet felt different here, deeper somehow, as if the trees absorbed sound more completely than they should have. Even their voices seemed muffled, swallowed by the massive Douglas firs that towered above them like ancient sentinels. They were a few miles from the main campsites, but Liam preferred the quiet anyway. He kept telling Owen they might see elk or deer if they waited patiently by the water's edge at dawn. Owen teased him about his rural wisdom and asked if they'd be able to text their wives from that remote spot. Their phones had zero reception, which Liam found refreshing. Owen, not so much. "What if there's an emergency?" he'd asked, holding his phone up toward different trees as if they might somehow boost the signal. The screen showed nothing but "no service" in sterile white letters. "That's what people did for thousands of years before cell towers," Liam had replied, but he could see the digital withdrawal in Owen's twitching fingers, the way he kept checking his pocket for phantom vibrations. Owen told him he kept hearing weird stories about unexplained events in the forest. Liam half laughed because folks love to spin tall tales when the pines start swaying in the wind. But as he spoke, Liam noticed how the stories all seemed to share certain elements: people going missing without a trace, strange sounds echoing through the valleys at night, animals behaving in ways that defied their nature. "You read too much internet garbage," Liam had said, but the words felt hollow even as he spoke them. There was something in the way Owen's voice had dropped to barely above a whisper when he mentioned the disappearances. Something that made the hair on Liam's arms stand up. That first morning they hiked a mile out from the camper, trudging through scattered brush, scanning for movement. The forest floor was carpeted with fallen needles that compressed under their boots with soft sighs. Every few steps, a branch would crack somewhere in the distance, causing them both to freeze and listen. But it was always just the natural settling of the woods, or so they told themselves. They found some tracks that might have been left by a deer pressed into a patch of soft earth near a small stream. They were deeper than deer tracks should have been, as if whatever made them had been carrying extra weight. But Liam convinced himself it was just the muddy conditions playing tricks on their eyes. The day felt as normal as any other hunting trip. There was a dryness in the wind, the crackle of leaves underfoot, and the straightforward rhythm of taking careful steps so they wouldn't spook any animals. But underneath that normality, he began to notice things that didn't quite fit. The absence of birds' songs in certain areas, as if invisible boundaries marked zones of silence. The way shadows seemed to linger longer than they should, even when clouds passed overhead. By noon, they'd set up near a small clearing with clear lines of sight. Owen started dozing off against a log, so Liam nudged him awake, joking that if an actual deer waltzed by, he wouldn't forgive himself for missing it. Owen retorted that Liam's constant chatter was the real reason they never saw anything. But as the afternoon wore on, Liam realized they hadn't seen any animals at all. No squirrels chittering in the branches, no birds calling to their mates, not even the distant movement of smaller creatures in the underbrush. The forest felt eerily sterile, as if something had swept through and cleared out all the natural life, leaving only the trees standing like empty shells. "Don't you think it's weird?" he finally asked Owen as they packed up their gear. "We've been out here all day and haven't seen so much as a chipmunk." Owen paused in rolling up his sleeping pad, considering this. Maybe we're just unlucky, or maybe our scent is stronger than we think. By late afternoon, the shadows grew long, and they decided to head back. Their boots crunched along the path, and for a second, Liam thought he heard a distant moan, like a distorted echo bouncing off the treetops. The sound seemed to come from directly above them, as if something large was moving through the canopy. But when they looked up, they saw nothing but empty branches swaying in a wind they couldn't feel at ground level. He paused, straining his ears, but Owen insisted it was the wind. It didn't sound like any wind Liam had ever heard before. It was too deliberate, too rhythmic, almost like breathing amplified and stretched across the distance. But he shrugged it off, unwilling to let his imagination run wild on the first day. They made it back to camp just before dusk. Tired and a little disappointed, they had nothing to show for their efforts. The camper sat exactly where they'd left it, but something felt different about the clearing. The shadows fell at wrong angles, and the creek seemed louder than it had been in the morning, as if the water was rushing faster over the stones. That night, as they sat around a small fire, Owen broke out a pack of marshmallows. The flames cast dancing shadows on his face, making his features appear to shift and change in the flickering light. They joked about how they'd become the stereotypical campers, roasting sweets and telling spooky stories. Liam recounted an old tale his dad used to share about a rumored predator that roamed the outskirts of some farmland back home. In the story, farmers would find their livestock drained of blood, but with no visible wounds, just small puncture marks behind the ears. The creature was never caught, never even clearly seen. But the attacks always stopped just before winter and resumed each spring like clockwork. They laughed, but when Liam finished, Owen looked down at his hands, his face serious in the firelight. He said he'd read a news article about 2 hikers who went missing near Mount Hood a month earlier. Park rangers had found a torn jacket, but no footprints leading anywhere. The jacket had been shredded from the inside out, as if something had torn its way free from within the fabric itself. No final explanation emerged, and the families were left with more questions than answers. The official report listed the cause as an animal attack, but Owen had done more digging. The local medical examiner had reportedly found tissue samples on the jacket that didn't match any known species in the Pacific Northwest database. They ran DNA tests 3 times, Owen said, poking at the fire with a stick. Sparks spiraled up into the darkness like dying stars. Each time came back as unknown origin, not human, not any catalogued animal, just unknown. Liam remembered an uneasy quiet settling in, broken only by the crackling of burning wood and the distant rush of water over stones. They forced themselves to laugh again, brushing it off as another tragic but isolated event. Deep inside, Liam felt a small knot of dread forming, but he didn't let it show. As the fire died down to glowing embers, he noticed that the normal sounds of the forest, the rustling of small creatures, the distant hoots of owls, even the whisper of wind through the branches, had all fallen silent. The only sound was their own breathing and the hypnotic babble of the creek. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. They slept fitfully that first night, though neither of them admitted it to the other until much later. Around midnight, Liam jolted awake to a strange rattling sound like metal scraping against stone. The noise seemed to come from multiple directions at once, creating a disorienting echo that made it impossible to pinpoint the source. His first thought was that it might be a raccoon foraging by the camper, maybe knocking over their cooking gear. So he unzipped the door to shoo it away. That's when he noticed the entire campsite felt oddly still. The trees stood silent, not even the faintest breeze stirring their branches. The creek had gone quiet too, which seemed impossible. Water doesn't just stop flowing. But in that moment, even the stones seemed to hold their breath. His flashlight flickered over some movement near the creek bank, and he caught a glimpse of a dark form that looked vaguely shaped like a large cat, only it stood on its hind legs briefly, then darted out of sight. The movement was all wrong, too fluid and deliberate for any animal he knew. It reminded him of the way shadows move across water, constantly shifting, never quite solid. His heart thundered against his ribs as he swept the beam back and forth across the area where he'd seen it. The light seemed weaker than it should have been, as if the darkness was actively resisting it, swallowing the illumination before it could reveal what was hiding in the shadows. He was used to seeing bobcats or even cougars out here, but this didn't match anything he'd come across. It looked broader, taller than any cat he knew, with limbs that seemed disproportionately long. When it had reared up on its hind legs, it had stood nearly 7 feet tall, and there was an intelligence in its posture that made his skin crawl. But it was the eyes that really got to him. Even in that brief glimpse, he could see they reflected light differently than any normal animal's eyes. Instead of the typical bright shine of the tapetum lucidum, these eyes seemed to absorb light and give it back wrong, as if the creature was viewing the world through some different spectrum of vision. He stayed still for several minutes, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. Just the oppressive silence and the feeling that something was scanning him in return, cataloging his movements, his scent, the rhythm of his breathing. Every instinct he'd developed during years of hunting was screaming that he was no longer the predator in this situation. Owen murmured something about him letting in the cold air. So, Liam zipped the camper back up and tried to convince himself he was just seeing things in the dim light. But as he lay there in the darkness, he could hear something moving around the perimeter of their campsite. Footsteps too heavy for a human, but too deliberate for an animal. The footsteps followed a pattern, circling them clockwise at a distance of maybe 30 yards. They would stop for long minutes at a time, as if whatever was making them had paused to observe them from a different angle. Then they would resume, always maintaining that precise distance, never getting closer but never moving away. He counted the circuits, 7 complete circles around their camp before the sounds finally faded into the distance. By then, dawn was starting to creep across the sky, painting the treetops with pale gray light. The next morning, Owen was up early, making instant coffee over their portable burner. He seemed refreshed, almost cheerful, humming some tune under his breath as he measured out the grounds. The contrast between Owen's mood and Liam's was jarring. Liam felt like he hadn't slept at all, his nerves stretched taut from the night's vigil. Owen asked why he seemed jumpy, and Liam told him he might have spotted something by the creek. When he described what he'd seen, Owen paused in his coffee preparation, the metal spoon scraping against the bottom of the pot with a sound uncomfortably similar to what Liam had heard the night before. "Could have been a bear," Owen said finally. "They can rear up on their hind legs when they're trying to get a better view of something." But even as he said it, Liam could tell Owen didn't quite believe it himself. Bears don't move with that liquid grace, and they certainly don't spend hours circling campsites with such methodical precision. Still, they both clung to the explanation because the alternative was too unsettling to consider. They decided to follow the creek downstream, partly to see if they could catch a deer heading for water, but mostly because Liam wanted to investigate the area where he'd seen the creature. In daylight, everything looked perfectly normal. The rocks showed no scratches from claws. The soft earth held no unusual tracks, and the creek babbled along as peacefully as if nothing had ever disturbed its banks. But there was something wrong with the vegetation. On the side of the creek where Liam had seen the creature, the grass and smaller plants were flattened in a pattern that didn't match wind damage or the natural dying back of autumn growth. It looked more like something large had lain there for an extended period, pressing the vegetation down with its body weight. They walked in single file for an hour, following the creek as it wound through increasingly dense forest. The trees here were older, their trunks so massive that it would have taken 3 or 4 people holding hands to encircle them. Hanging moss draped from the branches like funeral shrouds, and the air smelled of decay and fungus. Eventually, they came across a slope scattered with boulders. Patches of moss and lichen covered the rocks, making them slippery and treacherous. Some of the boulders were easily the size of small cars, and they were arranged in a way that seemed too deliberate to be natural, as if they'd been positioned to create corridors and hiding places. As they edged around the largest boulder, they discovered something that made both of them stop breathing for a moment. There, nestled between 2 of the massive rocks, was an abandoned campsite. A torn tent lay partially flattened, its bright blue fabric now stained with something dark and organic. The tears in the material weren't random. They followed deliberate patterns, as if whatever had made them possessed surgical precision. Several cans of food were strewn about, their labels peeled away by moisture and time, but they were still sealed. Whatever had happened here, the occupants hadn't been interrupted while eating. It looked like something had forced its way through the fabric of the tent from the inside, which made no sense. How could something get inside a zipped tent and then tear its way out? Unless it had been invited in, or unless it had been hiding inside from the beginning. Liam's stomach churned as he realized what they were looking at. This wasn't just an abandoned campsite, this was a crime scene. They found no sign of people, just a single sleeping bag flung aside, its synthetic filling scattered around the area like snow. The sleeping bag showed the same precise tear patterns as the tent, long parallel cuts that spoke of claws or teeth working with deliberate purpose. Owen muttered that they should report it, but they had no phone signal, and the nearest ranger station was a day's hike away. They marked the spot on their GPS device, though the coordinates seemed to shift each time they checked them, as if something was interfering with the satellite signals. They stayed near the site for several minutes, looking for any clues that might explain what had happened. The place was drenched in a sense of abrupt departure, but also something else. A feeling of terrible patience, as if whatever had done this was willing to wait as long as necessary for the right moment to strike. Liam picked up a muddy jacket that had been partially hidden under some fallen leaves. The fabric was torn and stained, but still recognizable as expensive outdoor gear. The inside label had initials embroidered in small letters, MG. There was a small rip near the shoulder with dark stains that looked suspiciously like old blood, though the rain and time had faded them to rust-colored smears. In the jacket's pockets, He found items that painted a picture of the missing person: a wallet with credit cards made out to Michael Gary, a trail map with several routes marked in red pen, and a small notebook filled with observations about wildlife sightings. The last entry, dated 3 weeks earlier, read, Day 4. Hearing voices in the trees, not human, getting closer each night. Owen swallowed hard when Liam showed him the notebook. Maybe these were the missing hikers he'd mentioned. Something about seeing actual evidence of someone's vanished presence made the situation real and alarming in a way that newspaper articles couldn't match. This was no tall tale or urban legend. Real people had been here, had experienced something terrible, and had simply disappeared without a trace. They decided to head back and find a way to contact the rangers. But as they gathered the evidence, Liam couldn't shake the feeling that they were being observed. The sensation was so strong that he kept turning around, expecting to see eyes watching them from between the trees. But there was never anything there, just the endless columns of Douglas fir stretching away into the green shadows. As they prepared to leave, he noticed that the arrangement of rocks around the campsite formed a perfect circle. It wasn't something you'd see unless you looked at it from above, but from their position on the slope, the pattern was unmistakable. The abandoned tent sat at the exact center of the circle, like some kind of offering placed on an altar. They packed up quickly, both of them eager to get away from that cursed place. But as they started back toward their own camp, Liam heard something that made his blood freeze in his veins. From somewhere high in the canopy above them came a sound like laughter, if laughter could be stripped of all warmth and joy and twisted into something purely malevolent. The sound followed them as they hurried back through the forest, always staying just at the edge of hearing, never quite close enough to pinpoint its location. It was as if something was playing with them, letting them know it was there without revealing itself completely. By the time they reached their own campsite, the sun was already beginning to set, painting the sky the color of old blood. The second night, neither of them slept well. They kept their fire burning later than they should have, feeding it branches until the flames reached nearly 4 feet high. The light seemed important somehow, a barrier between them and whatever was moving in the darkness beyond its reach. The second night, neither of them slept well. They kept their fire burning later than they should have, feeding it branches until the flames reached nearly 4 feet high. The light seemed important somehow, a barrier between them and whatever was moving in the darkness beyond its reach. Owen, came another voice, this one slightly different in pitch and tone. Owen, we've been waiting for you. The voices seemed to come from just outside the ring of their firelight, but when they grabbed flashlights and swept the beams across the surrounding forest, they saw nothing but empty trees and shadow. Yet the voices continued, growing more insistent, more detailed. Liam, your wife is worried about you. Come to the phone. Owen, there's been an accident. You need to come quickly. The mimicry was nearly perfect. The voices sounded like their wives, their mothers, people they cared about calling them home. But there was something wrong with the cadence, as if whoever was speaking had learned human speech from recordings and didn't quite understand the emotional rhythms that gave words their meaning. They huddled together by the fire, neither of them willing to respond to the calls. Every instinct screamed that acknowledging the voices would be a mistake, that whatever was out there was testing them, trying to lure them away from the safety of their camp. The voices continued for nearly an hour, cycling through different people from their lives, trying different emotional appeals. Sometimes they were pleading, sometimes angry, sometimes seductive. But underneath, each voice was the same alien quality, the same sense that something inhuman was wearing human sounds like an ill-fitting mask. Finally, as dawn approached, the voices faded away, but they left them both shaken, afraid to close their eyes even as exhaustion weighed heavy on their shoulders. The next morning, Liam found footprints. They were pressed deep into the soft earth around their campsite, following the exact same circular pattern he'd noticed the night before. But these weren't animal tracks, and they weren't human either. They were something in between, longer and narrower than human feet, with what looked like claw marks extending from where the toes would be. The stride was too long for a person, nearly 4 feet between each print. Whatever had made them was tall, maybe 7 or 8 feet, with legs disproportionately long for its body. The depth of the impression suggested something much heavier than its apparent size would indicate, as if its bones were made of stone rather than calcium. Jesus Christ, Owen breathed, staring down at the clearest of the prints. What the hell made these? Liam had no answer. The prints were unlike anything in his hunting experience, and he'd seen tracks from every major predator in the Pacific Northwest. These belonged to something else entirely, something that had never appeared in any field guide or nature documentary. They decided to pack up and get out of there. But as they were breaking down the camp, Liam noticed something that made his blood run cold. Mixed in with the strange tracks were human footprints. Their own footprints from the day before, perfectly preserved in the soft earth. But someone, or something, had been walking in them. Each of their prints had been carefully stepped in, as if the creature had been practicing walking like them, learning the rhythm and gait of human movement. The thought of something inhuman studying them so closely, mimicking their most basic behaviors, made his skin crawl with revulsion. They finished packing in record time, throwing their gear into the truck with shaking hands. But as they prepared to leave, Liam realized they had a problem. The access road they'd used to reach their campsite was blocked. A massive Douglas fir, easily 8 feet in diameter, lay across the narrow dirt track. It looked freshly fallen. The needles were still green, and he could smell the sharp scent of fresh cut wood, but there hadn't been any storms, no wind strong enough to topple such a massive tree. The cut was too clean, too straight to be natural. Someone or something had felled this tree deliberately, timing it to trap them in the forest just as they decided to leave. "We can try going around," Owen suggested, but the forest was too dense on either side of the road. Their truck would never make it through the underbrush and fallen logs. "We could try the hiking trail," Liam said, though the thought of walking out through miles of forest, with whatever was stalking them potentially waiting anywhere along the path, made his stomach clench with fear. Before they could decide on a course of action, they heard something that made both of them freeze. From somewhere behind them came the sound of snapping branches, as if something large was moving through the forest, heading in their direction. But it wasn't the sound of normal movement. Whatever was coming toward them was breaking through the undergrowth with mechanical precision, snapping branches and crushing vegetation in a perfectly straight line. It wasn't following animal paths or trying to move quietly. It was simply bulldozing through anything in its way, like a machine programmed to reach a specific destination. They jumped into the truck and locked the doors, though Liam knew how useless that would be against something strong enough to fell an 8-foot tree. Owen fumbled with the ignition, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get the key in place. The sound was getting closer. Through the windshield, Liam could see small trees swaying and falling as something massive pushed through them, but he still couldn't see what was making the noise. It was as if an invisible force was carving a path through the forest, leaving only destruction in its wake. The engine finally caught, and Owen threw it into reverse. But instead of backing down the road, he turned the wheel hard and drove straight into the forest. Branches scraped along the sides of the truck with sounds like fingernails on glass. But somehow they found a gap between the larger trees, a natural corridor that led roughly parallel to the blocked road. Behind them, the sound of destruction continued, but it seemed to be moving toward where their campsite had been rather than following them. Whatever was out there had expected them to stay put, to wait passively for it to reach them. Their sudden departure had apparently confused it, bought them precious time to escape. They crashed through the underbrush for what felt like hours, but was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. The truck's suspension screamed in protest as they bounced over fallen logs and through hidden ditches. Several times Liam was sure they were going to get stuck, but somehow Owen managed to keep them moving. Finally, they broke through the tree line and onto a paved road Liam recognized as Highway 26. They'd made it out of the forest, but as he looked back at the green wall of trees behind them, he couldn't shake the feeling that their escape had been allowed rather than earned. They drove in silence toward the nearest ranger station, both of them too shaken to speak about what they'd experienced. But Liam kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something impossible following them down the highway. Something that belonged in the deep woods, but had decided to venture into the human world. The ranger station was a small log building surrounded by government vehicles and signs warning about fire danger. Inside, a middle-aged man in a Forest Service uniform looked up from his paperwork with the weary expression of someone who'd heard too many strange stories from traumatized campers. They told him about the abandoned campsite, the strange tracks, the fallen tree blocking the road. They filled out lengthy forms and waited in uncomfortable plastic chairs that smelled of disinfectant and stale coffee. The ranger asked detailed questions about the location, the condition of the abandoned tent, the personal effects they'd found. But Liam noticed he didn't seem surprised by any of it. His questions were too specific, too practiced, as if he'd investigated similar incidents before. When Liam mentioned the strange footprints, the ranger made a note, but didn't ask for more details. When Owen described the voices calling their names, the ranger just nodded as if this was perfectly normal. "We'll send a team out to investigate," he said finally, closing his notebook with a snap. "In the meantime, I'd recommend avoiding that section of the forest for the rest of the hunting season." "The rest of the season?" Liam asked. "What about permanently?" The ranger looked at him with eyes that had seen too much. "Son, there are things in these woods that have been here longer than the trees themselves. The best we can do is try to keep people away from the places where they're most active." He handed them a business card with his contact information and told them to call if they remembered anything else. But as they walked back to the truck, Liam saw him pick up his phone and dial a number from memory. His voice was too quiet to hear the words, but his tone suggested he was making an urgent report to someone higher up the chain of command. They spent that night in a motel room in government camp, both of them too wired to sleep despite their exhaustion. Every small sound, the ice machine cycling on, footsteps in the hallway, the wind rattling the windows made them jump like spooked animals. Owen tried to rationalize what they'd experienced, suggesting explanations involving bears, hyraxes, maybe even mass hallucinations brought on by stress and isolation. But Liam could see in his eyes that Owen didn't believe his own theories any more than he did. Something was living in those woods, something that had learned to mimic human voices and behaviors while remaining utterly alien in its motivations. They'd stumbled into its territory and somehow managed to escape. But Liam had the unsettling feeling that their encounter was far from over. The creature knew who they were now. It had their scent, their voices, probably even their faces memorized from hours of careful observation. And judging by the evidence they'd found at the abandoned campsite, it was patient enough to wait for the perfect opportunity to finish what it had started. As he finally drifted off to sleep in the early hours of morning, Liam could swear he heard something scratching at the motel room window, something with claws trying to find a way inside. The next morning brought false security. Sunlight streamed through the motel curtains, and the normal sounds of traffic and human activity made the previous night's terrors seem like hallucinations born from stress and an overactive imagination. Owen was already up, sitting at the small table by the window with a cup of gas station coffee, scrolling through news websites on his phone. "Look at this," he said, turning the screen toward Liam. It was a local news article from 3 days earlier. Third hiker reported missing in Mount Hood area this month. The article was brief, clinical in its detachment. A 28-years-old experienced hiker named Jennifer Stevens had failed to return from a solo camping trip. Her car had been found at a trailhead, but search and rescue teams had found no trace of her despite extensive efforts. The story mentioned that this was the third disappearance in the area within 4 weeks, though it was careful to note that the cases might not be related. What caught Liam's attention was the photograph of Stevens. She was blonde, athletic, exactly the type of person who should have been able to handle herself in the wilderness. But in the photo, there was something in her eyes, a weariness, as if she'd sensed some approaching danger even before she disappeared. "We need to tell them about what we saw," Owen said. "The cops, the FBI, whoever handles this kind of thing, people are dying out there." But even as he said it, Liam could tell Owen was struggling with the same problem he was. How do you report something that sounds like a campfire story? How do you explain footprints that don't match any known animal? Voices that mimic missing persons, creatures that can fell massive trees with surgical precision. They decided to drive back toward the ranger station, partly to file an additional report, and partly because neither of them was ready to return to their normal lives while people were still disappearing. The highway seemed different in daylight, too normal, too mundane after what they'd experienced in the deep woods. But as they rounded a curve about 5 miles from the ranger station, they saw something that made Owen slam on the brakes. There, standing in the middle of the road, was a figure that looked almost human. It stood 7 feet tall with limbs that seemed too long for its torso, covered in dark hair that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Its face was the worst part, almost human in its basic structure, but with features that were subtly wrong. The eyes were too large, positioned slightly higher than they should have been. The mouth was too wide, filled with teeth that were too sharp and too numerous. But it was trying to look human. It stood upright on 2 legs, had arranged its arms at its sides in a mockery of normal posture. It had even attempted to mimic human facial expressions, though the result was more horrifying than any snarl or grimace would have been. It was holding something in its elongated hands, a cell phone, modern and sleek. As they watched in frozen terror, it raised the phone to its ear in a perfect imitation of a human making a call. "Help me," it said in a voice that was nearly Jennifer Stevens's voice, but not quite. The cadence was wrong, the emotional inflection off by just enough to make his flesh crawl. "Please help me, I'm lost in the woods," the creature was learning. It had studied the missing hikers, absorbed their speech patterns, their mannerisms, their belongings. Now, it was trying to use that knowledge to lure new victims, standing in the middle of a public road in broad daylight with the confidence of something that had never faced any real opposition. Owen threw the truck into reverse. But as they started backing away, the creature's head swiveled to track their movement with mechanical precision. When it looked directly at them, its 2 large eyes reflected the sunlight like mirrors, and its mouth opened in what might have been a smile if it had been on a human face. "Liam," it called, still using Jennifer Stevens's voice. "Owen, I've been waiting for you." That's when Liam realized the horrible truth. It hadn't been randomly hunting hikers. It had been collecting them, studying them, learning from them. The disappearances weren't random attacks. They were research, preparation for something larger. And now it was ready for the next phase of whatever it was planning. They sped backward down the highway as fast as Owen dared. But in the rearview mirror, Liam could see the creature following them with that same impossible stride he'd glimpsed at their campsite. It wasn't running. It was covering ground with long, fluid steps that should have been slow, but somehow kept pace with their truck, even at 40 mph. "The radio," he shouted. "Try the radio." Owen fumbled with the controls, finally finding an emergency frequency used by the Forest Service. Static filled the cab, punctuated by occasional bursts of distorted voice traffic. "Mayday, Mayday," Liam called into the microphone. "This is Liam. We're on Highway 26, approximately 5 miles east of the ranger station. There's something on the road, something dangerous. We need immediate assistance." The radio crackled with static for several seconds before a voice responded. "This is Ranger Station 7. Can you describe the nature of the emergency?" How could he describe what they were seeing? How could he explain that something that looked like a cross between a human and a nightmare was chasing their truck down a public highway while mimicking the voice of a missing hiker? "There's a creature," he said, knowing how insane the word sounded. "It's not human, but it's trying to look human. It's been taking the missing hikers." The radio went silent for a long moment. When the voice returned, it sounded tired, unsurprised. "Roger that. We're dispatching units to your location. Continue heading east and do not stop for any reason. Repeat, do not stop for any reason." The calm professionalism of the response suggested this wasn't the first report of its kind. Whatever was stalking the forests of Mount Hood, the authorities were aware of it. They'd been dealing with it for longer than the public knew. Behind them, the creature had stopped its pursuit and was now standing motionless in the middle of the highway. But as Liam watched through the rear window, it began to change. Its posture shifted, its limbs rearranging themselves, its face flowing like wax as it took on a new appearance. By the time they'd put a mile between them and it, the creature looked exactly like Jennifer Stevens. Not similar, identical. If he hadn't seen the transformation himself, he would have sworn it was the missing hiker standing on that empty stretch of road. It raised its hand and waved goodbye, a gesture so perfectly human and so utterly wrong coming from that thing that he felt his sanity slip a little further from his grasp. They reached the ranger station to find it surrounded by federal vehicles, black SUVs with government plates, unmarked vans bristling with communication equipment. Men and women in tactical gear carrying weapons he didn't recognize. This wasn't a local Forest Service response. This was something much larger and more organized. A woman in a dark suit approached their truck as they pulled into the parking lot. She was young, maybe 30, with the kind of intense focus that suggested a military or federal law enforcement background. "Mr. Hayes, Mr. Clark," she said, using their last names, though they'd never given them to anyone official. "I'm Agent Patricia Hayes, FBI. We need to talk." The next several hours were a blur of debriefing sessions, medical examinations, and forms with classifications he'd never heard of. Agent Hayes and her team asked detailed questions about everything they'd experienced, the voices, the tracks, the abandoned campsite, their encounter on the highway. But they weren't asking these questions like skeptics trying to debunk their story. They were asking them like investigators gathering evidence for a case they'd been working for a long time. "How long have you known about this thing?" Liam finally asked Hayes during a break between interview sessions. She looked at him for a long moment, apparently weighing how much she could reveal. "The first documented encounter was in 1987, she said finally. A family camping trip that ended with 3 missing persons and 1 survivor who insisted he'd been stalked by something that could perfectly mimic his wife's voice." 30 years, Owen breathed. "It's been doing this for 30 years. Longer, probably. We just didn't start keeping official records until 87. The Chinook tribe has stories about something similar that go back centuries. They called it the Mimic and considered the deep forest around Mount Hood to be cursed ground." Hayes pulled out a thick file folder and spread photographs across the table. Missing persons from across the Pacific Northwest, all of them hikers or campers who disappeared in remote wilderness areas. The photos spanned decades, but the circumstances were always similar. Experienced outdoors people vanishing without a trace, abandoned campsites with evidence of struggle, reports of strange sounds and sightings from other campers in the area. "We estimate it's been responsible for at least 40 disappearances over the past 3 decades, Hayes continued. But those are just the ones we can definitively link to its activities. The actual number is probably much higher. What is it? Liam asked, though he wasn't sure he wanted to hear the answer. Hayes closed the file and looked directly at him. We don't know. Our best guess is that it's some kind of apex predator that evolved in isolation, possibly in the extensive cave systems beneath Mount Hood. It's intelligent, more intelligent than any animal has a right to be. It can learn, adapt, mimic human behavior with remarkable accuracy. But why? Owen asked. What does it want? Survival, Hayes said simply. It's perfecting its hunting techniques, learning to exploit human psychology and social behavior to lure prey into vulnerable positions. The fact that it started venturing onto public roads suggests it's becoming bolder, more confident in its abilities. She paused, studying their faces. Which brings us to why you're both still alive. In 30 years of documented encounters, only a handful of people have seen this creature and lived to tell about it. The fact that it let you escape suggests either incredible luck on your part or what? Liam asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Or it's not done with you yet. That night, they put them up in a federal safe house, a nondescript building in Portland that looked like a mid-range hotel but was staffed with armed guards and equipped with security systems he couldn't even identify. They told them it was for their own protection, that the creature had demonstrated the ability to track individuals across considerable distances. But as Liam lay in the narrow bed, staring at the ceiling and listening to Owen toss and turn in the next room, he couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't guests in protective custody. They were bait. 6 months had passed since their encounter in Mount Hood National Forest, but the nightmares hadn't stopped for Liam. Neither had the feeling that something was watching him, waiting for the right moment to finish what it had started. He'd moved twice since then. First to a downtown Portland apartment with good lighting and lots of neighbors. Then to a suburban house with motion sensor lights and a comprehensive security system. It didn't matter. The thing he had seen in those woods wasn't bound by locks or lights or the illusion of urban safety. Agent Hayes maintained regular contact, checking in every few weeks to see if he'd experienced any unusual encounters. She never said it directly, but he knew what she was really asking: has the creature found you yet? The FBI task force, because there was a task force and had been for years, had had some success in tracking the thing's movements. They'd identified a pattern in the disappearances, a roughly circular territory centered on the deep wilderness areas around Mount Hood, but extending into parts of Washington and Northern California. It moved seasonally, following some internal logic that the behavioral experts were still trying to understand. What they had learned was disturbing. Analysis of the few crime scenes they'd been able to locate suggested that the creature didn't kill its victims immediately. Instead, it kept them alive for extended periods, apparently studying their behavior, their speech patterns, their emotional responses. It was building a database of human psychology, accumulating knowledge that made it more effective at mimicking them. The missing hiker's cell phone, the one it had been carrying when they saw it on the highway. They found Jennifer Stevens's body 3 weeks later, hidden in a cave system 40 miles from where she disappeared. The medical examiner estimated she'd been alive for at least 10 days after her disappearance. Plenty of time for the creature to learn everything it needed to know about her. But the most horrifying discovery came when they analyzed the voice recordings from their encounter. The creature hadn't just been mimicking Jennifer Stevens, it had been improving on her. The inflections, the emotional range, even subtle personality quirks that hadn't been present in the real woman's voice were there in the creature's imitation. It wasn't just copying its victims. It was absorbing them, integrating their memories and personalities into its own growing repertoire of human behaviors. Owen didn't handle the aftermath as well as Liam did. The stress, the constant looking over his shoulder, the knowledge that something inhuman was out there with their faces and voices cataloged in its memory. It broke something in him. He started drinking heavily, lost his job, went through a messy divorce. The last time Liam saw him, he was talking about moving to Florida, getting as far away from the Pacific Northwest as possible. "It's still out there," he kept saying, his hands shaking as he poured another glass of bourbon. "It's still out there, and it knows who we are." Liam wanted to tell him he was wrong, that distance would keep him safe, that the creature was bound to its territory in the mountains, but he couldn't. He'd done the research, read the classified reports Hayes had shared with him, studied the pattern of disappearances across the region. The creature's range was expanding. What started as isolated incidents around Mount Hood had spread to wilderness areas throughout the Pacific Northwest. Park rangers and Forest Service personnel had begun reporting similar encounters as far north as the Canadian border and as far south as Northern California. Either there were more of these things than anyone had realized, or the original creature was actively expanding its hunting grounds. Hayes thought it was the latter. She believed the creature was intelligent enough to recognize that its current territory was becoming too well monitored, too dangerous for hunting. So, it was exploring new areas, testing the boundaries of human awareness and response. "It's adapting faster than we are," she told him during their last meeting. "Every time we implement new protocols, adjust our monitoring systems, it finds a way around them. We're not hunting it anymore, it's studying us." That thought kept him awake at night. 3 weeks ago, he received a phone call at 2 a.m. The caller ID showed his own name, which should have been impossible. When he answered, he heard his own voice on the other end of the line, but speaking words he'd never said. "Hello, Liam," his voice said. "I've been practicing." The line went dead before he could respond. He called Hayes immediately, and she had federal technicians trace the call within hours. It had originated from a cell tower near Mount Hood, specifically from the same area where they'd had their encounter the year before. But what really terrified him was what the technicians told Hayes about the voice analysis. It wasn't a recording. The speech patterns, the vocal inflections, even the breathing between words, everything indicated that someone or something had been speaking live into the phone, using his exact vocal characteristics with perfect accuracy. The creature had learned to mimic him so completely that even sophisticated audio analysis couldn't tell the difference between its voice and his. Since then, he'd received similar calls every few days. Sometimes it was his voice, sometimes Owen's. Occasionally, the voices of people he didn't recognize, but who sounded terrified, pleading for help from locations he'd never been to. The calls always came from the same general area, and they were always brief, as if the creature was testing its abilities rather than trying to communicate any specific message. Hayes thought it was psychological warfare, an attempt to break down his mental defenses and make him more vulnerable to a direct approach. But Liam had a different theory. He thought it was practicing for something bigger, something that would require perfect impersonation abilities. The disappearances had changed, too. Instead of isolated hikers and campers, the creature had started targeting groups, entire families vanishing from campgrounds, search and rescue teams that went missing while investigating previous disappearances. Even park rangers who knew the dangers and carried military-grade communication equipment. It had gotten bolder, more confident in its abilities, and according to the classified reports Hayes shared with him, it had started leaving survivors. These survivors all told similar stories. Encounters with missing persons who tried to lure them away from safety, voices calling for help from the darkness. The feeling of being stalked by something that knew too much about their personal lives. But unlike earlier encounters, the creature now allowed some of these people to escape, to return to civilization with stories that were just believable enough to be taken seriously, but just strange enough to be dismissed by most authorities. Hayes thought it was building a network of witnesses, people whose testimonies would be discounted, but who carried the psychological trauma that made them ideal recruitment tools for future victims. Fear spreads faster than facts, and traumatized survivors are more likely to convince others to venture into the wilderness to investigate or prove what they've experienced. He thought she was right. He thought the creature had learned that direct hunting, while effective, was limited in scope. But if it could manipulate humans into coming to it voluntarily, if it could use their own curiosity and skepticism against them, then its potential prey expanded exponentially. Last month, he received a package with no return address. Inside was a USB drive containing video files, security camera footage from various locations around Mount Hood, time-stamped over the past 6 months. The footage showed the creature in different forms, wearing different faces, interacting with humans in ways that appeared perfectly normal until you knew what to look for. In one clip, it was working at a gas station, serving customers with Jennifer Stevens's face and voice. In another, it was sitting in a restaurant, eating dinner and making conversation with other diners while wearing the appearance of a missing park ranger named David Kim. Most disturbing was footage from a Portland shopping mall where it spent several hours walking among crowds, apparently studying human social behavior while looking like a composite of several different missing persons. It was living among them, undetected, learning from direct observation how to be more human than human. The final video on the drive was different from the others. It was taken from a fixed camera position and showed the creature in its natural form, the elongated limbs, the wrong-shaped face, the 2 large eyes. But it wasn't moving randomly or hunting. It was performing what looked like a ritual. The creature was arranging objects in a precise pattern, personal belongings from its victims, organized according to some system he couldn't understand. Watches, jewelry, driver's licenses, cell phones, all laid out in concentric circles around what appeared to be a central altar made from human bones. But what made him call Hayes immediately was what the creature was doing with these objects. It would pick up each item, hold it carefully, then seem to absorb something from it. Knowledge, memories, some essential quality that belonged to the original owner. After each absorption, it would change slightly, becoming more complex, more sophisticated. It wasn't just collecting trophies from its victims. It was incorporating their identities into its own expanding consciousness, becoming a composite entity with the memories and personalities of dozens of missing persons. Hayes confirmed what he'd suspected. The creature wasn't just evolving its hunting techniques. It was evolving itself, using human consciousness as raw material to build something larger, something more dangerous than a simple predator. "We think it's trying to become human," she told him during their emergency meeting. "Not just mimic us, but actually transform itself into something that can exist permanently in human society." The implications were staggering. If the creature succeeded in its transformation, if it learned to permanently assume human form while retaining its superhuman intelligence and predatory instincts, it could operate anywhere, hunt anyone, blend into human society with perfect camouflage. It would be the perfect predator, invisible and unstoppable. Tonight, he was writing this account because he received another phone call. This time, it wasn't his voice on the other end, it was Hayes's voice. Perfect in every detail, except for the slight wrongness in the emotional inflection that he'd learned to recognize. "Liam," the fake Hayes said, "we need you to come back to Mount Hood. We found something you need to see." He hung up immediately and called the real Hayes, but her phone went straight to voicemail. He tried her office, her emergency contact number, even the federal safe house where they'd first debriefed them. Nothing but automated messages and desk agents who claimed to have no knowledge of Agent Patricia Hayes or any ongoing investigation into unusual disappearances in the Mount Hood area. It was possible that the creature had finally moved against the federal task force, eliminating the people who knew the most about its activities. Or it was possible that Hayes and her team had gone deeper underground, operating from locations so classified that even other government employees didn't know they existed. But he had a third, more terrifying possibility. Maybe Hayes was never real. Maybe the entire federal response, the task force, the classified reports, the safe house, maybe all of it was an elaborate deception orchestrated by something with access to the memories and personalities of federal agents who disappeared years ago. How long had the creature been able to maintain long-term impersonations? How deep into human society had it already penetrated? If it could perfectly mimic anyone it had absorbed, then anyone could be the creature in disguise. His neighbors, his co-workers, the barista at the coffee shop he visited every morning. Any of them could be wearing a stolen face, studying him, waiting for the right moment to complete whatever process it started in the woods of Mount Hood. He was leaving Portland tonight, driving east until he ran out of gas or money or nerve. He didn't know if distance would keep him safe. The creature's range seemed to be expanding constantly, but staying here felt like accepting defeat. If anyone read this account, if his disappearance became another unsolved case in some federal database, they should remember what he learned in those woods. The forests of the Pacific Northwest are not empty wilderness. Something lives there that is older, smarter, and more patient than anything humans have evolved to defend against. It knows their voices, their faces, their fears. It can become anyone, say anything, appear anywhere that trees cast shadows and cell phones lose signal. And it's learning faster than they can adapt their defenses. The real horror wasn't that it existed, it was that it might not be alone. The Pacific Northwest covers thousands of square miles of remote wilderness, and they've only investigated a tiny fraction of the areas where people have reported similar encounters. How many more creatures like this were out there, studying them, learning from them, preparing for something they couldn't even imagine? He used to think the scariest thing about the wilderness was getting lost. Now he knew better. The scariest thing about the wilderness is being found. Liam's truck was discovered abandoned along Interstate 84 near the Oregon-Idaho border 3 days after this account was written. Despite extensive search efforts by multiple law enforcement agencies, no trace of Liam has ever been found. The investigation remains open, though it has been classified at levels that prevent public access to case files. Agent Patricia Hayes, if she ever existed, has no official record with the FBI or any other federal agency. The safe house address mentioned in this account corresponds to a building that has been vacant for over 10 years. Owen Clark was found dead in his Florida apartment 2 weeks after Liam's disappearance. The official cause of death was listed as suicide, though friends reported that he had been receiving strange phone calls in the days before his death. Calls that seemed to come from Liam, pleading for help from somewhere in the Oregon wilderness. The calls continued for several months after Liam's disappearance, always from the same general area around Mount Hood, always using Liam's voice. They stopped abruptly in March 2018, and no similar calls have been reported since. The Mount Hood National Forest remains open to the public, though certain remote areas are periodically closed for wildlife management activities. Official Park Service records show no unusual incident reports for the areas described in this account. Sometimes, hikers in the deep woods around Mount Hood report hearing voices calling for help from the darkness between the trees. The voices are always familiar. Friends, family members, loved ones, asking to be rescued from places no human should be able to reach. Park rangers advise visitors to ignore these voices completely. They advise never to answer when something calls your name from the forest. And they advise never, ever to go looking for the source of voices that sound too perfect, too familiar, too desperate for help. Because in the deep woods of the Pacific Northwest, the things that know your name are not the things you want to meet. The first thing one needed to understand about the Redwoods was that they changed a person. Not just in some poetic, nature-loving way, but in something deeper and more unsettling. They made a person feel small, yes, but they also made a person feel watched. As he stood at the entrance to Redwood National Park that October morning in 2021, his rifle slung across his shoulder and his backpack heavy with supplies, he should have listened to that creeping sensation crawling up his spine. His name was Ethan, and he'd been hunting these woods since he was 12 years old. His mother, God bless her sarcastic soul, used to say he had more trees in his blood than red cells. She'd raised him to appreciate the outdoors with a mixture of respect and dark humor that served him well in most situations. "Nature's beautiful, Ethan," she used to tell him while bandaging up scrapes from his childhood adventures. "But it's also got teeth. Remember that." He should have remembered that morning. The piercing cry that shattered the dawn silence was unlike anything he'd heard in over 20 years of hunting. It started low, almost human, then climbed to a shriek that made his bones ache. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing off the massive trunks of the ancient redwoods until it became a chorus of agony that lasted nearly 30 seconds. When it finally died away, the forest fell into the kind of silence that precedes terrible things. His friend Noah had been supposed to join him on this trip. They'd planned it for months, a long weekend of hunting in the deep sections of the park, far from the tourist trails and gift shops. But 3 days before they were set to leave, Noah had called him with the flu, his voice raspy and weak. "You sure you want to go alone, Ethan?" he'd asked through a coughing fit. "Those woods, there have been weird reports lately. Park rangers talking about strange sounds, campers finding things that don't make sense." "What kind of things?" Ethan had asked, but Noah had just coughed harder and said he wasn't sure. Just rumors and whispers among the park staff. Now, standing alone in the pre-dawn darkness with that inhuman cry still ringing in his ears, he wished he'd pressed him for details. The redwoods towered around him like cathedral pillars, their bark scarred and ancient, their tops disappearing into the morning mist. Patches of fog drifted between the trunks, creating shapes that looked almost human in his peripheral vision. Every 20 feet or so, he'd catch movement in the corner of his eye and turn to find nothing but more trees and more shadows. He'd chosen to enter the park through one of the lesser-used trailheads, planning to work his way deeper into the backcountry where the deer runs were more predictable and the hunting better. The path was barely visible, more of a game trail than anything maintained by the Park Service. Fallen logs blocked sections of it, forcing him to climb over or around obstacles that seemed deliberately placed to slow his progress. About a mile in, he found the first sign that something was wrong. A tree, a massive redwood that must have been 15 feet in diameter, had been stripped of its bark in long, parallel gouges that ran from the base up to about 12 feet high. The marks were too regular to be natural, too deep to be made by any animal he knew. They looked almost like claw marks, but scaled up to something impossibly large. Fresh sap bled from the wounds, dark and thick in the morning light. He ran his fingers along one of the gouges, feeling how the wood had been torn rather than cut. Whatever had made these marks possessed tremendous strength. The bottom of each groove was smooth, as if polished by repeated contact. He pulled out his phone to take a picture, but the device showed no signal. Not unusual this deep in the park, but still unsettling. As he examined the damaged tree, he became aware of an odor in the air. It was subtle at first, masked by the normal scents of the forest, earth, moss, and decomposing leaves. But as he breathed deeper, trying to identify it, the smell grew stronger. It was organic, but wrong somehow, like meat left too long in the sun, mixed with something sharper and more chemical. Following the scent led him off the main trail, deeper into a section of the forest where the trees grew so close together that their canopy blocked almost all direct sunlight. Here, the forest floor was carpeted with a thick layer of redwood needles that had been accumulating for decades. His footsteps made no sound as he walked, creating an eerie sensation of floating through the woods. The smell grew stronger as he went deeper, and with it came other signs of disturbance. Broken branches hung at odd angles, and more trees bore the strange claw marks. Some of the damage looked fresh, still weeping sap, while other marks appeared older, weathered, and dark. Then he found the clearing. It was perfectly circular, about 30 feet across, and completely devoid of the needle carpet that covered the rest of the forest floor. The earth here was hard, packed, and dark, almost black, and it felt wrong under his feet, too solid, too uniform. As he walked to the center of the clearing, he noticed that none of the surrounding trees had any low branches. They'd all been broken off or stripped away, creating a perfect cylinder of open space that extended up into the canopy. In the exact center of the clearing stood something that made his blood run cold, a set of wooden stairs. They were old but well maintained, rising about 20 feet into the air and ending in nothing. The construction was solid, professionally built with proper joints and hardware, but there was no foundation, no structure above or below to justify their existence. They simply stood there defying logic, as if someone had torn a staircase out of a building and planted it in the middle of the forest. He'd heard stories like this before, whispered rumors among hunters and hikers about mysterious staircases found in remote areas of national forests. Most people dismissed them as urban legends or hoaxes, but seeing one in person was deeply unsettling. The stairs seemed to radiate a wrongness, and he found himself unable to look directly at them for more than a few seconds at a time. As he circled the staircase, trying to make sense of what he was seeing, he noticed something else that chilled him to the bone. Carved into several of the nearby trees were names and dates. They weren't the typical graffiti of lovers or vandals. These had been carved deep into the bark with precision and care, as if they were meant as memorials. Jennifer Walsh, Sept 15, 2018. Marcus Chen, July 3, 2019. Patricia Kelly, April 28, 2020. There were dozens of them, some so old the bark had begun to grow over the letters. He pulled out a small notebook and began copying them down, his hands shaking slightly as the implications sank in. These weren't just random names, they were records, a catalog of something terrible. The last name on the list, carved into a tree directly facing the stairs, was still sharp and fresh in the bark. Robert Young, October 1st, 2021. That was 3 days ago. As he finished writing down Robert Young's name, that piercing cry echoed through the forest again, closer this time and definitely coming from the direction he'd been headed. But now it sounded different. Not entirely animal, but not entirely human either. It sounded hungry. He shouldered his rifle and started moving deeper into the woods, following a path that seemed to have been worn smooth by heavy, repeated use. Behind him, the mysterious staircase stood sentinel over its clearing of names, and he couldn't shake the feeling that by finding it, he'd crossed some invisible threshold. The real hunt was just beginning, and he was starting to suspect he wasn't the predator in these woods. The path beyond the clearing of stairs led deeper into the forest, winding between massive redwood trunks that grew closer together as he progressed. The canopy above became so thick that it filtered the morning light into a green-tinged twilight, creating an underwater feeling that made his movements seem slow and dreamlike. Every few hundred yards, he found more evidence of the thing he was now certain he was tracking, deep gouges in tree bark, always at the same height, always in groups of 4 parallel lines, broken branches hanging like arthritic fingers, and always that underlying smell of decay and wrongness that seemed to be growing stronger. But it was the other signs, the human signs, that made his skin crawl. About 2 miles from the staircase clearing, he found a backpack hanging from a branch about 15 feet off the ground. It was a standard hiking pack, forest green with multiple pockets and straps, the kind sold at any outdoor gear store. But it had been shredded, not cut, but torn apart as if something with incredible strength had simply ripped it open like tissue paper. The contents were scattered across the forest floor below: a water bottle, dented and punctured energy bars with teeth marks that were too large to be human, a compass with its glass face cracked, and its needle spinning wildly, and a wallet. The driver's license inside belonged to Robert Young, 34 years old, from Henderson, Nevada. The photo showed a pleasant-faced man with thinning brown hair and kind eyes. According to the license, he'd been an organ donor. The irony of that detail, given his current circumstances, made his stomach turn. Along with the license, he found a folded photograph that had somehow avoided the destruction that claimed everything else. It showed Robert with what appeared to be his family, a woman about his age and 2 young children, a boy and a girl. They were standing next to a camping trailer, all smiling at the camera. The picture of an ordinary family on an ordinary vacation. The photo was dated just 2 weeks ago. He carefully folded the picture and slipped it into his jacket pocket, though he wasn't sure why. Some instinct told him it was important, that Robert Young deserved better than to be forgotten in these woods, with no one knowing what had happened to him. As he continued following the trail, he began to notice something disturbing about the forest itself. The damage to the trees wasn't random. It followed a pattern. The claw marks were always made at specific intervals, as if whatever was making them was marking territory or leaving some kind of message. And the broken branches weren't just casualties of a large creature moving through the woods. They'd been deliberately snapped and arranged, creating formations that almost looked like crude symbols. The most unsettling discovery came when he found what remained of Robert Young's campsite. It was tucked into a small depression, surrounded by fallen logs, a natural shelter that any experienced camper would choose. But the scene that greeted him looked like a hurricane had torn through it. A dome tent had been shredded and scattered, its bright orange fabric hanging from branches like prayer flags. The metal poles were twisted into impossible shapes, bent and knotted as if they were made of soft wire instead of aluminum. A sleeping bag had been torn open and its stuffing spread across the area like artificial snow. Camping gear was scattered everywhere, a bent cookpot here, a twisted camp stove there, a flashlight with its lens crushed and its batteries corroded with some kind of acidic substance that had eaten through the metal casing. But it was what he found at the center of the destroyed campsite that made him reach for his rifle with shaking hands. In the soft earth, pressed deep into the ground, was a footprint. But it wasn't human. The print was roughly the same size as a human footprint, but wrong in every detail. Instead of 5 toes, it had 4, each ending in what appeared to be a sharp claw. The heel was elongated and narrow, and the arch was so pronounced it looked almost bird-like. But the most disturbing aspect was the depth of the impression. Whatever had made this print was incredibly heavy, much heavier than any human. And there were more prints, dozens of them, circling the destroyed campsite in a pattern that suggested the creature had spent considerable time here, perhaps studying what it had found or deciding what to do with it. He knelt next to the clearest print and used his hand for scale as he took pictures with his phone, grateful when the device showed it still had enough battery despite the lack of signal. The prints were at least 2 inches longer than his size 11 boots and significantly wider. If these were indeed footprints, they belonged to something that stood at least 8 feet tall. Following the trail of prints away from the campsite, he discovered they led to a small stream that ran through the forest, its water dark and cold, and moving faster than seemed natural for such a small waterway. The prints continued on the far side, but they were different now, deeper and spaced farther apart, as if whatever made them was now carrying something heavy. Or someone. The thought hit him like a physical blow. Robert Young hadn't just disappeared, he'd been taken. And judging by the violence of the scene he'd found, he might not have gone quietly. As he waded across the stream, the ice-cold water soaking through his boots and chilling his feet, he noticed something floating in a small eddy near the far bank. At first he thought it was a piece of debris, maybe part of Robert's destroyed camping gear. But as he got closer, he realized it was clothing, a flannel shirt, torn and stained with something dark that didn't look like mud. The fabric was caught on a submerged branch, waving in the current like a desperate hand. He fished it out of the water and examined it more closely. The tears weren't random. They looked like the same claw marks he'd been seeing on the trees, 4 parallel slashes that had shredded the cotton fabric. Worse than the damage to the shirt was what he found in the breast pocket. A small notebook, waterlogged but still readable. The pages were filled with Robert Young's neat handwriting, documenting what appeared to be several days of increasingly disturbing experiences in the forest. The first entries were normal enough, notes about wildlife sightings, weather observations, the kind of things any naturalist might record. But as the days progressed, the entries became more erratic and frightened. Day 3, strange sounds at night, not like any animal I know, seems to circle the campsite but never comes close enough to see. Day 4, found weird scratches on trees near my tent, deep gouges too high up to be a bear. Something's watching me, I can feel it. Day 5, it came closer last night. I could hear it breathing outside my tent. Heavy, raspy breathing like it had been running. I didn't sleep at all. Day 6, I have to get out of here. Something's very wrong with this place. The trees themselves seem alive, moving when there's no wind, and those stairs I found yesterday, I keep seeing them in my dreams. The final entry was barely legible, the writing shaky and desperate. It's in the camp. God help me, it's in the camp. If someone finds this, tell my wife I love her. Tell her I tried to. The entry ended in a dark stain that could have been water damage or something worse. He stuffed the notebook into his jacket next to Robert's family photo and continued following the trail. The prints led away from the stream and up a steep slope covered with ferns and fallen logs. The terrain became more difficult as he climbed, forcing him to use his hands to pull himself over obstacles and around the massive buttressed roots of ancient trees. About halfway up the slope, he found another campsite, or what was left of it, along with a small pile of personal effects that included a driver's license and a journal. The scene showed the same signs of extreme violence. The tent had been completely destroyed, and gear was scattered across a wide area as if it had been thrown by something with tremendous force. But this journal told a different story. Its owner, a woman named Megan, seemed less focused on the creature and more concerned with something else she'd discovered. I've been mapping the claw marks on the trees and they form a pattern. Not random at all, they're marking out territories or paths, maybe both. Whatever's making them is intelligent. Found 3 more staircases today. Each one in a clearing just like the first. They're all exactly the same design, same height, same construction. This can't be coincidence. The stairs are connected somehow. I've been hiking between them, and each clearing has the same names carved in the trees, the same dates. It's like a record being kept by something that doesn't want these people to be forgotten. There are others here, other people. I've seen glimpses of them moving through the trees, but when I try to approach, they disappear. They move wrong, like they're hurt or changed somehow. Her final entry was the most chilling. I understand now. The stairs aren't just markers, they're bait. The creature uses them to draw people in, and once you've seen them, you can't leave. The forest won't let you. I've been trying to find my way back to the main trail for 3 days, but every path leads deeper in. The compass spins uselessly, and my GPS just shows static. The others I've seen, the people moving through the trees. I think they were campers and hikers like me, but they're not really people anymore. There's something else, something in between. It's getting dark and I can hear it coming. The breathing, the footsteps that are too heavy and spaced too far apart. I'm going to hide this journal and hope someone finds it. If you're reading this, get out. Don't try to save anyone. Don't investigate the stairs. Just run. He looked up from the journal to find that the forest around him had grown noticeably darker, though he couldn't tell if it was approaching evening or if the canopy had simply grown thicker. Either way, he was running out of time. As he gathered the journal and prepared to continue following the trail, he heard something that made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. The sound of footsteps moving through the forest toward him, but they weren't human footsteps. They were too heavy, too widely spaced, and they came with that wet, raspy breathing that Robert Young had described in his final journal entry. The creature had found his trail, and it was coming for him. The footsteps were getting closer, accompanied by the sound of branches snapping under tremendous weight. He shouldered his rifle and began moving as quickly and quietly as possible up the slope, using the massive redwood trunks for cover. Behind him, the sounds of pursuit grew louder and more urgent, as if whatever was following had caught his scent and no longer cared about stealth. Every few seconds, he risked a glance over his shoulder, but the thick undergrowth and lengthening shadows made it impossible to see more than a few yards in any direction. The forest seemed to be closing in around him, the spaces between trees growing narrower, the fallen logs more difficult to navigate. It was as if the woods themselves were conspiring to slow his escape. The slope leveled out into another clearing. This one was larger than the others he'd found, and like the rest, it contained a staircase. But this one was different. Where the others had been weathered wood, this staircase appeared to be made of some kind of dark metal that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. The steps were wider, more like a pyramid than a conventional staircase, and they were covered with symbols that hurt to look at directly. More disturbing than the staircase itself were the figures he could see moving in the tree line around the clearing. At first, he thought they were other hikers or campers, and he felt a surge of relief at the prospect of finding other living people in this nightmare forest. But as his eyes adjusted to the dim light, he realized that while these figures might once have been people, they were something else now. They moved with a jerky, unnatural gait, their arms swinging too loosely at their sides. Their clothes were torn and stained, hanging in tatters from frames that seemed somehow wrong, too tall, too thin, joints bending at angles that shouldn't be possible. And their faces, when he caught glimpses of their faces in the shadows, were slack and expressionless, eyes reflecting the dim light like an animal's. These were the others that the second journal had mentioned, people who had come into the forest and been changed by whatever lurked in its depths. He counted at least 6 of them circling the clearing, moving with purpose but without urgency, as if they had all the time in the world. They seemed to be waiting for something, and he had a terrible suspicion he knew what that something was. The sound of heavy footsteps behind him was getting closer, and he realized he was trapped. The changed humans, if that's what they still were, blocked his path forward, and the creature he'd been tracking was approaching from behind. The clearing, with its impossible staircase, was the only open ground available, but something instinctive told him that entering it would be a mistake. That's when he heard the voice, "Help us." It was barely a whisper, coming from somewhere to his left. He turned to see one of the changed figures standing just inside the tree line, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. Its mouth was moving, but the voice seemed to come from somewhere else entirely. "Please," it continued in that same tortured whisper, "help us remember." The figure took a step toward him, and he could see more details in the dim light. It had been a woman once, probably in her 30s, with long dark hair that was now matted and filthy. Her clothes, hiking boots, cargo pants, a fleece jacket, suggested she'd been a serious outdoors enthusiast. But her eyes were completely black, and when she opened her mouth to speak, he could see that her teeth had been filed or worn into sharp points. "We can't remember," she said, taking another step closer. "Can't remember who we were, can't remember our names." Other figures began emerging from the tree line, all of them moving with that same unnatural gait. A man in a torn park ranger uniform, his badge still gleaming on his chest. A teenager wearing a Boy Scout outfit, merit badge sash hanging in shreds. An elderly man in expensive hiking gear, his gray hair caked with mud and leaves. "Help us remember," they chanted in unison, their voices creating a horrible harmony. "Help us remember who we were." He raised his rifle, though he wasn't sure he could bring himself to shoot what might still be human beings, no matter how changed they'd become. But before he could make that decision, the creature that had been stalking him finally revealed itself. It emerged from the forest behind him with a sound like breaking bones, and the first sight of it nearly drove him to his knees in terror. The thing was enormous, at least 8 feet tall but impossibly thin, as if it had been stretched on some cosmic rack. Its limbs were grotesquely elongated, arms that hung nearly to the ground, ending in hands tipped with black claws. Its skin was the color of old parchment and seemed to hang loose on its frame, as if it were wearing the hide of some larger creature. But it was the face that would haunt his nightmares for the rest of his life. It was almost human, but wrong in every detail. The eyes were too large and completely black, like pools of oil in its skull. Its nose was little more than slits in its face. And its mouth was too wide, stretching nearly from ear to ear, filled with rows of needle-sharp teeth that seemed to go on forever. When it saw him looking at it, the creature smiled, an expression so horrible on that inhuman face that he nearly lost control of his bladder. Then it spoke, and its voice was like the sound of wind through a cemetery. "You found them," it said, gesturing toward the changed humans with one impossibly long arm. "My collection, my family, they were lost like you are lost, but I helped them find their way home." The changed humans began moving closer, forming a rough circle around him. Their black eyes never left his face, and he could see something like hunger in their expressions, or maybe desperation. "They forgot who they were," the creature continued, its voice filled with mock sympathy. "Forgot their names, their lives, their purpose, so I gave them a new purpose, I gave them peace." "What are you?" he managed to ask, his voice barely above a whisper. The creature's impossible smile widened. "I am the shepherd," it said. "I am the keeper of the lost, and you, little hunter, are very, very lost." It was right. He was lost, more thoroughly than he'd ever been in his life. But not just geographically. He was lost in a situation that his rational mind couldn't process, facing something that shouldn't exist in a world that suddenly seemed full of impossible things. The changed humans were only a few feet away now, their hands reaching toward him with movements that were almost gentle. He could smell them, that same odor of decay and wrongness that permeated the entire forest, but mixed with something else, something that might once have been human. "Don't fight it," the woman who had first spoken to him said, her black eyes reflecting the dim light. "It doesn't hurt, the forgetting, it's actually peaceful." "You just let go," added the man in the ranger uniform. "Let go of all the things that made you afraid, all the things that made you sad. Let go of yourself." He looked from one face to another, seeing variations on the same theme: emptiness, peace, and something that might have been relief. These people had found a kind of answer to the human condition, even if it meant giving up their humanity in the process. But as tempting as that peace might be, he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. He fired a warning shot into the air. The sound of the rifle echoed through the forest like thunder. The changed humans didn't even flinch. But the creature, the shepherd, threw back its head and laughed, a sound like breaking glass and screaming wind. "You cannot hurt what is already dead," it said. You cannot save what is already lost, and you cannot leave what has already claimed you. That's when he noticed that the trees around the clearing had changed. Where there had been gaps between the trunks, paths that led deeper into the forest, there was now only a solid wall of bark and shadow. The forest had indeed closed around him, trapping him in this nightmare clearing with its impossible staircase and its collection of lost souls. But he'd spent his entire life in these woods, and he knew something the creature might not. The forest was old, but it wasn't perfect. There were always gaps, always ways through if you knew where to look. He waited until the changed humans were almost close enough to touch him. Then he did something that went against every hunting instinct he'd ever developed. He ran directly toward the shepherd. The creature was so surprised by this move that it actually took a step backward, giving him just enough space to dodge around its impossibly long legs and plunge into the forest beyond the clearing. He heard it roar behind him, a sound like a mountain falling, and then the entire forest seemed to explode into motion. Branches whipped at his face as he ran. Roots tried to catch his feet, and the very air seemed to thicken around him, as if trying to slow his escape. But he'd been running through these woods since he was a child, and desperation gave him a speed he'd never possessed before. Behind him, he could hear the shepherd crashing through the underbrush, its massive form snapping trees like matchsticks. The changed humans were following as well, their movements eerily silent but somehow more frightening than the creature's obvious presence. He ran without direction, without a plan, driven only by the primitive need to put distance between himself and the horrors he'd discovered. But as he ran, he began to realize that the forest was fighting him at every turn. Paths that should have led downhill toward the main trails instead curved back on themselves. Clearings he was sure he'd never seen before appeared in places where they shouldn't exist, and always, the sound of pursuit grew closer. The shepherd was hurting him. He realized it wasn't trying to catch him. Not yet. It was driving him toward something, some destination it had chosen. And given what he'd already discovered about its methods, he was sure he wouldn't like what waited at the end of this chase. But he had one advantage the creature might not have anticipated. He still remembered who he was. He remembered his name, his life, his purpose, and he was determined to get out of these woods alive, no matter what waited in the darkness ahead. The real test was just beginning. He ran for what felt like hours through a forest that had become a living maze. Each turn led him deeper into a landscape that defied logic and geography. The trees seemed to shift position when he wasn't looking directly at them. Paths appeared and vanished like mirages, and the very ground beneath his feet felt unstable, as if it might give way at any moment. The pursuit had become more organized. He could hear the shepherd's heavy footsteps maintaining a steady pace behind him, never getting closer, but never falling behind. The changed humans had spread out, flanking him on both sides, occasionally visible as pale shapes moving through the shadows. They were herding him like wolves driving prey toward a killing ground. But it was the forest itself that was the most active participant in this hunt. Branches reached out to snag his clothing. Roots erupted from the ground to trip him. And more than once, he found his path blocked by fallen trees that he was certain hadn't been there moments before. The redwoods themselves seemed to be closing ranks, their massive trunks forming an increasingly narrow corridor that allowed him only one direction to travel. As he ran, he began to notice more evidence of the shepherd's long presence in these woods. Carved into tree trunks at regular intervals were symbols that matched those he'd seen on the metal staircase, angular marks that seemed to shift and writhe when he tried to focus on them. They formed a trail of sorts, marking a route that led ever deeper into the forest's heart. And there were more stairs, dozens of them scattered throughout the woods like some impossible art installation. Each staircase was different, some made of wood, others of stone, a few of that same light-absorbing metal, but all rose the same height and ended in empty air. They stood in clearings where the names of the missing were carved into surrounding trees. creating galleries of the lost that stretched back decades. The dates he could make out told a horrifying story. The earliest went back to the 1970s, suggesting the shepherd had been hunting in these woods for over 50 years. The missing weren't just hikers and campers. He saw names that corresponded to park rangers, researchers, even law enforcement officers who had presumably come looking for previous victims. How had this gone unnoticed for so long? How had an entire predatory ecosystem evolved in the heart of a national park without anyone in authority taking action? Unless, he realized with growing dread, they had noticed. Maybe the Park Service knew exactly what was happening in these woods and had decided that the cost of dealing with it was too high. Maybe the shepherd and its collection of changed humans weren't the only monsters in this story. The corridor of trees was narrowing even further now, forcing him to duck under low-hanging branches and squeeze between trunks that seemed to be actively moving to block his path. The sound of pursuit was getting closer, and he could hear something new in the mix, voices calling his name. "Ethan," came a woman's voice from somewhere to his left. "Ethan, don't run from us, we just want to help." "We're family now," added a man's voice from the right. "All of us together in the forest, no more loneliness, no more fear." But it was the third voice that nearly stopped him cold. "Ethan, son. Why are you running?" It was his mother's voice, perfect in every detail, warm and concerned and completely impossible. His mother had died 3 years ago, and he'd been the one to identify her body at the hospital. But the voice was so accurate, so perfectly her, that he actually slowed down and looked toward the sound. In the shadows between the trees, he could see a figure that might have been her, waving for him to come closer. "It's all right, honey," the voice continued. "You don't have to be afraid anymore, just come to Mama." The shepherd was using the voices of the lost to hunt him. He realized it had taken not just their bodies, but their memories, their identities, their connections to the living world. It could speak with the voice of anyone who had ever entered these woods and failed to leave. He forced himself to keep running, even as more familiar voices called out to him from the darkness. His friend Noah's voice, pleading with him to stop and wait for him. His father's voice, telling him everything was going to be all right. Even Robert Young's voice, thanking him for trying to find him and asking him to give up the search. The psychological warfare was almost more effective than the physical pursuit. Part of him wanted to stop, wanted to believe that these people were somehow still alive and could be saved. But the rational part of his mind knew that they were gone, absorbed into something larger and more terrible than individual human consciousness. The corridor of trees ended abruptly at the edge of what he initially thought was a natural clearing. But as he stumbled into the open space, gasping for breath and nearly exhausted from the long chase, he realized he'd been brought to something far more significant than just another gap in the forest. He was standing at the center of what could only be called a cathedral. The redwoods around the clearing were the largest he'd ever seen, their trunks so massive that it would take 20 people holding hands to circle just one of them. They rose like pillars into a canopy so high it seemed to touch the sky itself, creating a natural dome that filtered the afternoon light into something ethereal and otherworldly. But it was what filled the space between these giant trees that took his breath away and nearly broke his sanity. Staircases, hundreds of them, maybe thousands, arranged in concentric circles that spiraled inward toward the center of the clearing. Each staircase was different in material, design, and condition, but all were exactly the same height, and all led to nothing but empty air. They formed a forest within the forest, a maze of impossible architecture that seemed to extend in all directions. And surrounding each staircase, carved into the bark of the giant redwoods, were names. Thousands upon thousands of names, each with a date, creating a memorial wall that documented decades of loss and disappearance. The sheer scale of it was overwhelming. This wasn't just a hunting ground. It was a museum, a monument to every person who had ever been lost in these woods. In the center of this impossible construction, standing at the base of the largest staircase, one made of the same dark metal as the others, but covered in symbols that seemed to glow with their own inner light, was the shepherd. It was even more horrible to see clearly in the filtered cathedral light. Its pale skin was covered in scars and markings that looked like the symbols carved on the trees and stairs. Its black eyes reflected the light like mirrors, and its impossible mouth was stretched in that constant, terrible smile. But now he could see that it wasn't alone. Standing around it in perfect formation were dozens of the changed humans, all facing outward like guards or disciples. They stood utterly still, hands at their sides, faces blank and peaceful. Among them, he could recognize some of the people whose belongings he'd found during his journey: Robert Young, Megan Phillips, others whose faces he'd seen in photographs or on driver's licenses. But they weren't just victims anymore. They were something else, something between human and whatever the shepherd was. Their eyes were still black, but their faces had taken on some of the shepherd's inhuman characteristics. Their limbs were slightly too long, their fingers tipped with small claws, their teeth sharp and predatory. The shepherd was creating a new species. He realized it wasn't just collecting the lost, it was transforming them, making them into something that could survive in this twisted version of the natural world it had created. "Welcome home, Ethan," the shepherd said, its voice echoing strangely in the cathedral space. "You have seen my work, witnessed my purpose. You understand now what this place is." "It's an abattoir," he said, surprised by the steadiness of his own voice. "You're harvesting people." The shepherd's smile somehow grew even wider. "I am preserving them," it corrected, "saving them from the terrible burden of being human. Look around you, see how many I have gathered, how many I have given peace." He did look around, and the sight nearly brought him to his knees. The scale of the loss represented in this place was staggering. Families, friends, entire communities must have been devastated by the disappearances documented here. And all of it had been hidden, swept under the rug by authorities who found it easier to classify these people as missing rather than confront the truth of what was taking them. "They come to me lost," the shepherd continued, beginning to walk toward him with slow, deliberate steps. "Lost in the woods, lost in their lives, lost in their own minds. I give them direction, I give them purpose, I give them eternity." "You give them slavery," he countered, backing away but finding his retreat blocked by the changed humans who had silently moved to surround him. "Freedom," the shepherd corrected. "Freedom from choice, from doubt, from the endless pain of being alone in an indifferent universe. They are part of something larger now, something eternal and beautiful." He looked at the faces of the changed humans around him and tried to see beauty in their empty expressions. But all he saw was loss, the loss of everything that made them individuals, everything that made them human. "What are you?" he asked again, though he was beginning to suspect he knew the answer. "I am what remains," the shepherd said, now close enough that he could smell its breath, the odor of centuries of decay and transformation. When the first humans came to these woods, they brought with them all their fears and sorrows and desperate needs. They carved their names into my trees, built their roads through my domain, tried to tame the wildness that had existed here since before their species drew breath. It circled him as it spoke, like a lecturer addressing a student. But the forest remembers, the forest endures, and sometimes when the need is great enough, the forest fights back. The truth hit him like a physical blow. The shepherd wasn't some external monster that had invaded the forest. It was the forest, or at least some manifestation of it. It was what the wilderness had become in response to decades of human intrusion, a predatory consciousness born from the collective desire of nature to reclaim what had been taken from it. "You're a reaction," he said, understanding flooding through him, "an immune response." The shepherd's terrible smile became almost proud. "Very good, little hunter, yes. I am what grows in the dark places when the balance is disturbed. I am what feeds on the lost and the forgotten. And I am what ensures that the forest remains wild, no matter how hard your species tries to tame it." The changed humans began moving closer, their empty eyes fixed on his face, but now he could see something else in those expressions. Not just emptiness, but longing. A desperate hunger for something they could no longer remember but still craved. "They want to remember," he said, the pieces finally falling into place. "That's what they were trying to tell me. They want to remember who they were. But they cannot," the shepherd said with mock sadness. "That is the price of peace. To forget the pain of being human, they must forget being human at all. It is a bargain they all make willingly in the end." "But what if they didn't?" he asked, an idea forming in his mind. "What if they could remember without the pain? What if there was another way?" The shepherd's expression flickered for just a moment, its eternal smile wavering. "There is no other way," it said, but there was uncertainty in its voice now. He looked at the changed humans surrounding him and made a decision that would either save his life or end it in the most horrible way possible. Instead of trying to run or fight, he began to speak. "Robert Young," he said, looking directly at the figure he recognized from the driver's license photo. "Your wife loves you. Your children miss you. You were camping because you needed to think about changing jobs, remember? You wanted to provide better for your family." Robert's black eyes flickered for just an instant. "Megan Phillips," he continued, turning to another familiar face. "You came here to study the ecosystem. You were writing a paper about old-growth forest preservation. You wanted to make a difference." More flickering, more signs of recognition in faces that had been completely blank moments before. The shepherd roared, a sound of rage and fear that shook the entire cathedral. "Stop," it commanded. "You cannot restore what has been properly forgotten." But he kept talking, pulling out the photographs and journal entries he'd collected during his journey, reading names and details and human connections back to people who had been stripped of their identity. And with each name, each memory, each connection to the world beyond the forest, the changed humans began to change again. The transformation was painful to watch. Their faces contorted as memories flooded back. Their bodies shook with the agony of rediscovering their humanity. And several of them cried out in voices that were becoming more human with each passing second. But they were becoming human again. They were remembering, and the shepherd, he realized, was dying. With each recovered memory, each restored connection, the creature seemed to diminish. Its impossible height decreased, its terrible smile faded, and its black eyes began to reflect something other than emptiness. "What have you done?" it whispered, its voice no longer the sound of wind through tombstones, but something almost human. "I reminded them who they are," he said. "I gave them back their names." The forest around them began to shift and change, the impossible architecture of stairs and symbols fading like a dream upon waking. The cathedral of giant redwoods remained, but it was just trees now, just a natural clearing in a normal forest. And the shepherd was becoming something else entirely, something smaller, more fragile, more human. But the danger wasn't over yet. As the creature diminished and the changed humans struggled to rediscover their humanity, he realized that he still had to find a way out of these woods. And somewhere in the distance, he could hear the sound of helicopters approaching. The real world was coming to find him, but he wasn't sure he was ready to return to it. Not after what he'd seen, what he'd learned about the dark spaces between the civilized and the wild. The hardest part of any hunt isn't the tracking or the killing. It's coming home afterward and trying to pretend that the world is still the same place it was when you left. The transformation of the changed humans was not a gentle process. As their memories returned, they collapsed one by one, writhing on the forest floor as decades of suppressed humanity flooded back into a consciousness that had been hollowed out and reshaped by the shepherd's influence. Their cries echoed through the cathedral of redwoods, a chorus of agony and rebirth that was both beautiful and terrible to witness. Robert Young was the first to fully recover, his black eyes clearing to their original brown as he struggled to his knees. "Sarah," he whispered, his voice raw and broken. "My wife, my children. Oh God, what did I do? What did I become?" Ethan knelt beside him and pulled out the family photograph he'd carried through the nightmare. Robert's hands shook as he took it, tears streaming down his face as he stared at the images of the people he'd forgotten. "You survived," Ethan told him, though he wasn't sure that was entirely true. "You came back." Megan Phillips recovered next, her scientific mind reasserting itself as she took in the impossible scene around her. "The ecosystem," she muttered, looking at the fading staircases and symbols. It was never about territory or hunting grounds, it was about consciousness, a gestalt entity born from the intersection of human impact and natural resistance. Even as she spoke, the supernatural elements of the forest were continuing to fade. The staircases were becoming transparent, dissolving like mist in morning sunlight. The symbols carved into the trees were healing over, bark flowing back into place as if they'd never existed. The cathedral itself was shrinking, the giant redwoods resuming their normal, if still impressive, proportions. But it was the shepherd's transformation that was the most disturbing to watch. The creature that had terrorized these woods for decades was diminishing with each human memory that was restored. Its impossible height collapsed, its elongated limbs shortened, and its terrible face began to take on more human characteristics. But the process wasn't making it more human, it was revealing what it had been all along. As the last of its supernatural aspects faded away, what remained was an elderly man, naked and frail, shivering in the cool forest air. His hair was long and white, his skin weathered and scarred, his eyes no longer black but a faded blue that held decades of accumulated madness. "I remember," he whispered, his voice now completely human and utterly broken. "I remember who I was, before I became what I needed to become." Ethan wrapped him in his jacket, though part of him recoiled from touching the creature that had orchestrated so much horror. "Who are you?" he asked. "Thomas," he said, the name seeming to cause him physical pain. "Thomas Mitchell, park ranger. I came here in 1973 to investigate reports of missing hikers, but the forest was so angry, so hurt, so many people trampling through, leaving their garbage, carving their names, taking pieces home as souvenirs." His eyes focused on something Ethan couldn't see, lost in memories that were older than he was. "I could hear it crying, the forest. In my dreams, in quiet moments, I could hear it weeping for what it had lost, and I thought I could help. I thought I could become what it needed." "You became a monster," Ethan said, thinking of all the names carved into trees, all the families destroyed by his actions. "I became what was necessary," Thomas replied, but there was doubt in his voice now. "I became the immune system, the white blood cell that fought off the infection of human presence. For 50 years, I kept the deep forest wild and free." Around them, more of the changed humans were recovering their memories and their humanity. Some were crying, overwhelmed by the return of emotions and connections they'd been cut off from. Others were catatonic, unable to process the transition. A few seemed genuinely relieved, as if awakening from a long, troubled dream, but all of them were damaged in ways that might never heal. They'd lived for months or years or decades as something other than human, serving a purpose that required them to forget everything that made them who they were. The psychological trauma of that experience would likely haunt them for whatever time they had left. The sound of helicopters was getting closer now, and he could hear voices in the distance. Search and rescue teams, finally arriving to investigate his garbled radio transmission from what felt like a lifetime ago. Soon this place would be swarming with park rangers, police, medical personnel, and eventually, researchers who would try to make sense of what had happened here. But how could anyone make sense of it? How could he possibly explain that an ecosystem had developed consciousness and begun actively defending itself? That a park ranger had transformed himself into a supernatural predator and spent 50 years collecting lost souls? That dozens of missing persons cases could be solved simply by restoring the humanity that had been stolen from the victims. "They won't believe it," Megan said, as if reading his thoughts. She was helping another recovered human, a teenage boy who'd apparently been missing for over a year, stay on his feet as his legs relearned how to support his weight. Even with all of us as witnesses, they'll find ways to rationalize what happened. Mass hallucination, ergot poisoning, shared psychological break, anything but the truth. She was probably right. The world he was about to return to was one where forests were just collections of trees, where consciousness belonged only to individual organisms, where the supernatural was safely contained in books and movies. The idea that nature itself could become predatory in response to human intrusion was too dangerous, too threatening to the fundamental assumptions of modern civilization. "What are we going to tell them?" Robert asked, still clutching his family photograph. "About where we've been, what we became." Before Ethan could answer, the first rescue helicopter appeared overhead, its rotors chopping through the cathedral air and destroying the last vestiges of the supernatural atmosphere that had defined this place. Spotlights stabbed down through the canopy, and amplified voices began calling out standard search and rescue protocols. Thomas, the former shepherd, looked up at the mechanical intruder with an expression of profound sadness. "It begins again," he said quietly. "More people in the forest, more disruption. The balance will shift once more." "Maybe not," Ethan said, an idea forming in his mind. "Maybe there's another way." He looked around at the recovered humans, at the fading evidence of a supernatural presence, at the ancient trees that had witnessed more than any living thing should have to witness. There had to be a middle path, a way to protect both the wilderness and the people who were drawn to it. "What if we tell the truth?" he said. "Not the whole truth, not the supernatural parts that no one would believe, but the important parts. That people have been disappearing in these woods for decades, that there's something here that makes conventional search and rescue efforts ineffective." Megan nodded slowly. "We could push for restrictions on access to the deep forest, require permits, guides, better tracking systems, make it harder for people to simply vanish. And," he added, looking at Thomas, "we could find ways to address the underlying problem. Less intrusive tourism, more funding for habitat preservation, better education about wilderness respect." The old man, it was hard to think of him as anything but human now, despite what he'd seen him do, seemed to consider this. "The forest would still need protection," he said finally. "Something to watch over it to ensure the balance is maintained. Then you'll have to learn a new way to do that job," Ethan told him. "A human way, no more collecting the lost, no more supernatural hunting, just stewardship." Thomas looked at his hands, at the human fingers that had so recently been tipped with claws. "I don't know if I remember how to be human," he admitted. "None of us do," said Robert, helping another recovered victim to her feet. "We'll have to figure it out together." The rescue teams had found them now, their voices growing closer as they followed Ethan's earlier trail through the forest. Soon, they'd be surrounded by well-meaning people asking questions they couldn't fully answer, taking them back to a world that hadn't changed, even though they had been utterly transformed by their experience. But as he listened to the approaching voices, he felt something he hadn't expected to feel again: hope. Not just for his own survival, but for the possibility that this nightmare might actually lead to something better. A new understanding between the human world and the wild places that existed at its edges. The forest around them looked normal now, just trees and shadows and ordinary wildlife sounds. But he knew that beneath the surface, something profound had changed. The consciousness that had manifested as the shepherd was still there, still watching, still protecting. But maybe now it would find ways to do so that didn't require the sacrifice of human lives and memories. As the first rescue worker broke through the tree line and called out in relief at finding them alive, he took one last look around the cathedral clearing. The staircases were completely gone now. The carved names had healed over, and the supernatural architecture had faded into memory. But the trees themselves remained ancient and patient and wise. And somewhere in the distance, barely audible over the noise of helicopters and human voices, he thought he could hear something that might have been the forest itself, not crying now, but singing a quiet song of reconciliation and hope. The hunt was over. The real work was just beginning. 6 months after his rescue from Redwood National Park, Ethan sat in his apartment outside Portland, trying to write a report that no one would ever read. The official investigation concluded that Thomas Mitchell, a park ranger who had been declared dead in 1974, had been living as a hermit in the deep forest, and had somehow convinced a number of missing persons to join him in his wilderness lifestyle. Mental illness was blamed for his transformation into what the reports carefully termed a charismatic cult leader with survivalist delusions. The recovered victims were treated for exposure, malnutrition, and severe psychological trauma. Most were eventually reunited with their families, though the process of reintegration had been difficult for everyone involved. Several had been institutionalized. Others had simply disappeared again, unable to cope with returning to a world they'd learned to forget. Robert Young moved his family to a small town in Nevada and refused to talk to reporters. Megan Phillips finished her doctorate and now worked for the Forest Service, advocating for wilderness preservation policies that, while never mentioning the supernatural, addressed many of the underlying issues that created the shepherd in the first place. Thomas Mitchell was serving a life sentence in a psychiatric facility, officially charged with multiple counts of kidnapping and false imprisonment. Ethan visited him sometimes, and they talked about the forest, about balance, about the ways that civilization and wilderness can coexist without destroying each other. The old man had aged rapidly since his transformation ended, as if 50 years of supernatural existence were catching up with him all at once. But sometimes, when he thought no one was watching, his eyes took on a distant look, and Ethan knew he was listening to something the rest of them couldn't hear. The official report listed 43 recovered victims, but Ethan knew there were more names on those trees than that. Some of the changed humans never fully recovered their humanity. They slipped away during the chaos of the rescue operation, disappearing back into the forest before anyone could stop them. Search teams had looked for them, but the deep woods seemed to have swallowed them up as completely as they once swallowed the original missing persons. The forest protects its own, he supposed, even when they're caught between two worlds. As for Ethan, he hadn't been hunting since that day. Every time he thought about entering the woods with a rifle, he remembered the feeling of being stalked, of being nothing more than prey in something else's territory. Instead, he'd become something he never thought he'd be, an advocate. He gave talks at hunting clubs and outdoor gear stores, spreading what he called wilderness awareness, teaching people to respect the places they visit, to understand that they're guests in ecosystems that existed long before humans and will hopefully exist long after they're gone. He didn't tell them about the shepherd, of course, but he tried to convey the essential truth that he learned in that cathedral of redwoods. The wilderness is not empty space waiting to be filled with human activity. It's a living system with its own needs and its own ways of defending itself. Some people listened. Others dismissed him as just another tree hugger who's lost his taste for blood sport. But every person who entered the forest with a little more respect, a little more awareness of their impact, was a small victory. The Park Service implemented new policies for the deep wilderness areas of Redwood National Park. Permits are now required for extended backcountry camping. GPS beacons are mandatory for solo hikers, and there are regular ranger patrols in areas that were previously left completely wild. Officially, these changes are in response to the unusually high number of missing persons cases that were solved during his rescue. Unofficially, He thought some people in the Park Service understood that there are forces in the wilderness that require careful management. Missing persons cases in the park have dropped to nearly zero since the new policies were implemented. Whether that's because of better safety protocols, or because the consciousness that once manifested as the shepherd has found new ways to protect its territory, he couldn't say for certain. But sometimes, when he was driving through the redwood country on his way to give another talk about wilderness respect, he'd catch a glimpse of something moving between the trees, something tall and pale and impossible, watching the road with eyes that might be blue or might be black, depending on the light. And he'd slow down, roll down his window, and nod respectfully to whatever guardian spirit had taken up residence in those ancient woods. Because he learned something in that cathedral clearing that he'd never forget. The forest remembers everything. It remembers every name carved into its bark, every piece of trash left behind, every drop of blood spilled on its soil. But it also remembers acts of respect, moments of wonder, and people who understand that some things are more important than human convenience. The shepherd was gone, transformed back into the broken human being he'd tried so hard to escape. But the consciousness that created him was still there, still watching, still protecting. It had just learned a more subtle approach to the job. And as long as people like him kept reminding visitors that they're guests in something larger and older and wiser than themselves, maybe that consciousness would continue to find ways to maintain the balance without requiring the ultimate sacrifice from those who wandered too far from the light. The hunt was over, but the forest endures. And in the spaces between the civilized and the wild, something patient and ancient continues to watch over the places where humans fear to tread, ensuring that no matter how much of the world we claim for ourselves, there will always be corners of darkness where older powers still hold sway. The trees remember, and they're still singing their quiet songs of warning and protection and hope. The truck's engine coughed to a stop beside the weathered wooden sign that read Kanatack Lake Ranger Station. Elevation 2947 feet. The new ranger, Finn, killed the headlights and sat in the sudden darkness, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. 3 months ago, he'd been processing insurance claims in a windowless office in Phoenix. Now, he was about to spend the next 6 months alone in the Alaskan wilderness, and he wasn't entirely sure why. That wasn't true. He knew exactly why. The incident report had been brief. Ranger Station KL7 requires immediate staffing due to unexpected vacancy. Previous Ranger J. Morrison, medical leave, stress-related breakdown, remote posting, winter access limited. Suitable for experienced personnel only. What it didn't mention was that Morrison had been the third ranger to leave that post in 18 months. What it also didn't mention was that Finn was desperate enough to take any job that put 3,000 miles between him and the wreckage he'd left behind. He grabbed his duffel bag and the box of supplies he'd picked up in Fairbanks, then trudged through ankle-deep snow toward the cabin. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a solid log structure with a metal roof and a wraparound porch. Smoke curled from the chimney. Morrison had left the fire going for him, along with a note on the kitchen table. Water pumps finicky. Prime it twice. Radio check every morning at 0800 with dispatch. Snowshoes in the shed. Good luck, JM. That was it. No mention of why he'd left, no details about the medical leave. Finn had tried calling him before leaving Phoenix, but his number went straight to voicemail. The supervisor who'd hired him, Rodriguez, had been equally tight-lipped. Morrison's a good man, he'd said, just couldn't handle the isolation anymore. Some people aren't cut out for solo postings. But sitting in that cabin on his first night, surrounded by Morrison's abandoned belongings, half-empty coffee cans, dog-eared paperback novels, a calendar with days crossed off in increasingly frantic scratches, Finn wondered if it was really isolation that had driven him away. The next morning brought his first real taste of the job. He'd barely finished his coffee when the radio crackled to life. KL7, this is dispatch. We've got a missing hiker, male, mid-40s, last seen heading toward the North Trail 3 days ago. Family reported him overdue. You copy? Finn grabbed the radio. This is KL7. Copy on the missing hiker. I'll need a description and last known position. What followed was a day-long search through terrain that wanted to kill a person. The North Trail led up into a maze of ridges and ravines where the snow lay 6 feet deep in places. He found the hiker's campsite around noon, tent still standing, food bag hanging properly from a tree branch. No signs of struggle. It was like the man had simply walked away from his life and vanished. He found him 4 hours later, sitting beneath a massive spruce tree with his back to the trunk, eyes closed, peaceful as a sleeping child. Hypothermia had taken him gently, the way it often does. No violence, no drama, just the wilderness claiming another life with quiet efficiency. But as he radioed for the helicopter to extract the body, Finn noticed something that made him pause. The snow around the tree was disturbed in a perfect circle, as if something large had paced around the dead man. The tracks were unlike anything he'd seen. Too big for a moose, the wrong shape for a bear, and whatever had made them walked on 2 legs. He mentioned the tracks in his report, describing them as unidentified large mammal prints. Rodriguez called him that evening. First body is always rough, he said, but you did good work out there. Morrison never would have found him that fast. About those tracks I mentioned. Tracks get weird in the snow, Rodriguez cut him off. Sun melts them, wind shapes them, wouldn't worry about it. But Finn did worry about it. That night, he took Morrison's journal from the shelf where he'd left it. Left it deliberately, he now realized. The entries started normal enough routine observations about weather and wildlife. But as the months progressed, the tone changed. Something's been watching the cabin. Found tracks again this morning. Same pattern as before, called Rodriguez, but he thinks it's bear sign. I know what bear tracks look like. 3rd missing person this season. All found the same way, sitting peaceful, no signs of struggle, weird tracks in a circle around the body, starting to think they didn't die of exposure. It came right up to the porch last night, heard it breathing outside my window, slow, deliberate, like it was thinking. Footsteps shake the whole cabin. The final entry was dated 2 weeks ago. I can't do this anymore. It's not just the isolation. Something lives in these woods, something that shouldn't exist. I've seen it twice now. Tall as a tree, covered in dark fur, watching me from the ridge. When it walks away, the forest goes completely silent. No birds, no wind, nothing. Just the sound of my heart hammering in my chest. Rodriguez will send someone else. I pray they're stronger than I am. Finn closed the journal and looked out the window at the moonlit forest. The snow glowed pale blue, and shadows moved between the trees. Normal shadows cast by normal branches swaying in a normal wind. But Morrison's words echoed in his mind. When it walks away, the forest goes completely silent. That's when he heard the footsteps. They were slow, methodical, circling the cabin at a distance of maybe 50 yards, too heavy for a person, too regular for a bear. Each step landed with a wet thud that seemed to vibrate through the ground and into the cabin's foundation. He grabbed his rifle and moved to the window, but the footsteps stopped the moment he approached. The forest had gone completely silent. He stood there for 20 minutes, rifle ready, watching the tree line. Nothing moved, no wind, no night sounds, no rustle of small creatures in the underbrush. Just a crushing, absolute silence that pressed against his eardrums like deep water. Then, from somewhere impossibly far away, came a sound he'd never forget. A low, mournful howl that seemed to contain all the loneliness and fury of the wilderness itself. It rose and fell like a funeral dirge, echoing off the mountains until he couldn't tell where it originated. The sound crawled into his bones and stayed there, vibrating through his skeleton long after it faded. When his hearing returned, the normal sounds of night gradually resumed. An owl called, wind sighed through the pines, small things scurried through the snow. He didn't go to bed that night. He sat at the kitchen table with Morrison's journal and his rifle, reading the entries by lamplight while snow began to fall outside. By morning, there were new tracks in the yard. The same impossible prints he'd found around the dead hiker, circling the cabin in a perfect spiral that ended at his front door. He should have called Rodriguez. He should have requested immediate extraction. Instead, he made coffee and radioed in his morning check as if nothing had happened. Because despite the fear crawling through his veins like ice water, he felt something else too. A terrible, irresistible curiosity. Whatever was out there, it had driven away 3 trained park rangers in 18 months. It left bodies sitting peaceful in the snow and howled at the moon like some primordial grief made manifest. And now it was watching him. He wanted to see it for himself. 3 weeks passed before he encountered it again. 3 weeks of normal ranger duties, checking trails, maintaining equipment, filing reports that grew increasingly brief and matter-of-fact. He found 2 more bodies in that time. A solo backpacker who'd gotten turned around in a whiteout, and an experienced hunter who'd apparently dropped dead of a heart attack while field dressing a caribou. Both had the same circular track pattern around them. Both wore expressions of perfect peace. He stopped mentioning the tracks in his reports. Rodriguez had made it clear he didn't want to hear about them, and Finn was beginning to understand why. The tracks were becoming more frequent, more bold. Whatever made them was losing its fear of human presence, or maybe it was growing more interested. He started leaving the cabin at night. It sounded insane now, but at the time, it felt like the only rational response. The thing was clearly nocturnal, clearly intelligent, and clearly studying him. Traditional wisdom says you don't go hunting for a predator in the dark, but traditional wisdom assumes you're dealing with something that follows normal predator behavior. This was something else entirely. His first night hunt yielded nothing but sore feet and a growing sense that he was being watched from just beyond the reach of his flashlight. The beam seemed pathetically small against the vast darkness of the forest, illuminating a 20-foot circle of snow and pine needles while leaving everything else to the imagination. But on the second night, he found where it lived. The cave mouth was hidden behind a screen of frost-covered branches, nearly invisible until you were close enough to feel the warm air flowing from within. The entrance was tall enough for a man to walk upright, wide enough for something much larger. The tracks led directly inside, disappearing into a darkness that his flashlight couldn't penetrate. He should have turned back then, should have marked the location and called for backup. Instead, he tied a length of rope to a tree and followed it into the cave. The tunnel sloped downward for maybe 30 feet before opening into a chamber the size of a small church. His flashlight beam swept across smooth stone walls adorned with what looked like primitive artwork. Handprints pressed into clay, strange symbols scratched into the rock face, and figures that might have been human, if humans grew 10 feet tall and walked with a distinctive, forward-leaning gait. But it was the smell that made his stomach turn. Not the clean animal musk he'd expected, but something far worse. The sweet, sick odor of decay mixed with something else, something that reminded him of wet dog and rotting meat and fierce sweat, all combined into one overwhelming assault on his nostrils. The floor was carpeted with bones, not scattered randomly, but arranged in careful patterns. Spirals and circles and lines that radiated from a central depression like spokes on a wheel. Human bones mixed with animal remains, ribs and femurs and skulls, creating geometric designs that spoke of intelligence and purpose, and something approaching artistry. In the center of it all sat a pile of personal belongings, backpacks and hiking boots, wallets and watches, cell phones and cameras. The accumulated possessions of people who'd entered these woods and never left, He recognized some items from missing person reports he'd read. Others looked much older, dating back years or even decades. That's when he realized the truth. The peaceful expressions on those bodies, the lack of struggle, the way they were found sitting upright like they'd simply decided to rest and never wake up. They hadn't died of exposure. They'd been brought here to this place, and when whatever use they'd served was complete, they'd been returned to the forest to die quietly in the snow. The question was, what use? He never got a chance to investigate further. A sound from the tunnel behind him made him spin around, the soft scrape of something large moving through the narrow passage. He killed his flashlight and pressed himself against the cave wall, hoping the darkness would hide him. It didn't. The thing that emerged from the tunnel was everything Morrison had described and worse. 9 feet tall at least, covered in dark fur that seemed to absorb what little light filtered into the cave. Its face was a horrifying blend of human and animal features. Intelligent eyes set in a protruding muzzle, filled with teeth designed for tearing meat. But it was the hands that terrified him most. Long, articulated fingers that looked capable of delicate manipulation, tipped with claws that could open a man like a tin can. It moved with the fluid grace of a predator, scanning the chamber with those terrible eyes until its gaze fixed on his hiding place. When their eyes met, Finn felt something shift in his mind. Not telepathy exactly, but a presence pressing against the inside of his skull like thumbs against his temples. Images flashed through his consciousness. The missing hikers walking calmly through the forest, their faces blank and peaceful. The thing guiding them, herding them, bringing them to this place for some purpose he couldn't understand. And then, when it was finished with them, leading them back to quiet spots in the wilderness where they would sit down in the snow and wait for death with the patience of the drugged. The presence in his mind grew stronger, more insistent. He felt his own will beginning to slip, his muscles relaxing despite his terror. Part of him wanted to step forward, to join the spiral of bones, to become part of whatever ancient pattern governed this place. But the rope in his hand, the one he'd tied to the tree outside, suddenly went taut. Someone was pulling on it from outside the cave. The creature's head snapped toward the tunnel entrance, ears twitching at some sound he couldn't hear. In that moment of distraction, he broke free of its mental hold and ran. The tunnel felt twice as long on the way out, and he could hear the thing pursuing him, not running, but moving with deliberate, terrifying confidence. It knew he couldn't escape. It knew these woods better than he could ever hope to. It had all the time in the world. But he reached the surface first, bursting from the cave mouth into the pre-dawn darkness to find Morrison standing beside the rope, rifle in hand, his face grim with determination. "Thought you might need backup," he said quietly. They ran together through the forest, neither speaking until they reached the relative safety of the cabin. Only then did Morrison explain. He'd never really left. He'd been camping in an abandoned hunting shack 5 miles south, watching the ranger station, waiting for the new guy to either run screaming or end up like the others. "You're the 4th ranger they've sent here," he told Finn over coffee that tasted like salvation. "I couldn't let another one disappear without trying to help." "What is that thing?" Morrison shook his head. "Indigenous peoples around here have stories about it. Koyukan legends speak of the woodsman, a guardian spirit that protects the forest from those who would exploit it. But this isn't protection. This is something else, something that's been twisted by decades or centuries of isolation and hunger. The bones in that cave. I know, I saw them too. It's been collecting people for a long time. The question is why. They never did figure out the why." The next morning brought a radio call from Rodriguez. "Pack it up, both of you. We're closing that station permanently. Some rich environmentalist bought the whole area, wants to turn it into a private preserve. No more public access, no more ranger station." Finn and Morrison exchanged glances. "Just like that?" Finn asked. "Just like that. Truck will be there this afternoon to pick you up." As they packed their gear, Finn found himself looking back toward the forest where something ancient and malevolent continued its patient hunt. The closure felt too convenient, too coincidental. He wondered how many other environmental preserves existed around the country. How many other places where dangerous things were allowed to flourish in isolation. But he didn't voice these thoughts. He was alive. Morrison was alive, and they were leaving. That felt like victory enough. The truck arrived precisely at noon, driven by a silent man in expensive outdoor gear who didn't give his name. As they loaded their belongings into the back, Finn caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line. A tall, dark shape watching their departure with patient intelligence. The woodsman of Kanatack Lake would have to find new prey now. The forest was his again, as it had always been, as it was always meant to be. But late at night, when the wind howls through the mountains and civilized people lock their doors against the darkness, Finn sometimes wonders if closing that station really solved anything. Or if they simply moved the problem somewhere else, to some other remote corner of the wilderness where rangers go missing and bodies are found sitting peaceful in the snow. Some hunts never really end. 6 months later, Finn was working a desk job in Anchorage when the first reports started coming in. Hikers disappearing near Denali. Bodies found in peaceful poses, tracks that didn't match any known animal. Morrison called him on a Tuesday morning, his voice tight with familiar dread. "It's moved," he said without preamble. "The thing from Kanatack, it's not staying put anymore." Finn had been expecting this call. Ever since they'd left the lake, he'd been monitoring missing person reports across Alaska, watching for the pattern they both knew too well. The peaceful deaths, the circular tracks, the complete absence of struggle or fear in the victims. "How many so far?" he asked. 12 confirmed in the last 3 months, all in different locations, all following the same pattern. It's not territorial anymore, it's nomadic. This was worse than he'd feared. At Kanatack Lake, the creature had been contained by geography and isolation. Now it was mobile, free to hunt across thousands of square miles of wilderness, and with each kill, it seemed to be growing bolder. "There's something else," Morrison continued. "I've been talking to other rangers, comparing notes. This isn't isolated to Alaska. Similar disappearances in Montana, Idaho, northern Washington. The pattern is spreading." Finn closed his eyes, feeling the weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders like a lead blanket. They'd encountered something that shouldn't exist, and instead of finding a way to stop it, they'd run. Now it was metastasizing across the entire Pacific Northwest. "What do you want to do about it? Meet me in Fairbanks tomorrow. There's someone you need to talk to." The someone turned out to be Dr. Alina Vasquez, an anthropologist from the University of Alaska who'd been studying indigenous folklore for 30 years. Morrison had reached out to her after their encounter, hoping to understand what they'd really faced in that cave. She met them in a coffee shop downtown, a small woman with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much. Without preamble, she spread a map across their table and began marking locations with a red pen. "Your creature isn't unique," she said bluntly. "Indigenous communities throughout the Pacific Northwest have stories about similar entities, beings that exist on the boundary between human and animal, predator and protector. The Salish call them Siatko, the Haida know them as Gadget, different names, same essential description." She marked another location on the map. "What's interesting is the historical pattern. These sightings cluster around areas of environmental destruction, logging operations, mining camps, oil drilling sites. The creatures seem to appear in response to human encroachment, as if the land itself is fighting back." "But the one we encountered wasn't protecting anything," Finn protested. "It was killing people." Dr. Vasquez fixed him with a steady stare. Was it, or was it collecting them for some other purpose? The question hung in the air like smoke. He thought about the cave, the careful arrangement of bones, the personal belongings sorted and displayed like museum exhibits. There had been purpose in that organization, intelligence behind the patterns. The Koyukin have a legend, she continued, about the woodsman who guards the spirit paths between worlds. According to the stories, he collects those who venture too deep into the wilderness, not to harm them, but to guide them to the next realm. The deaths are peaceful because the victims willingly follow him into whatever comes after. That's insane, Morrison said. You're talking about mass murder. Am I, or am I talking about a form of existence we don't understand, operating according to rules we can't comprehend? She leaned back in her chair. Consider this, every person your creature has taken was alone in the wilderness, far from help, likely to die anyway from exposure or accident. Perhaps it's showing them mercy. The idea was horrifying in its logic. Finn had seen enough wilderness deaths to know how ugly they usually were, slow, painful, filled with terror and regret. The creature's victims died peacefully, surrounded by something that understood the forest better than any human ever could. But that didn't make it right. How do we stop it? He asked. Dr. Vasquez shook her head. You don't. These beings have existed for thousands of years, long before European contact, long before modern civilization. They're part of the ecosystem, as natural as wolves or bears. The question isn't how to stop it, it's how to coexist with it. Tell that to the families of the missing hikers. Tell that to the forests being clear-cut, the rivers being poisoned, the mountains being stripped for minerals. She shot back. Your creature appeared at Kanatak Lake shortly after a major logging operation moved through the area. It's expanding its territory as human development pushes deeper into the wilderness. Maybe it's not the predator in this equation. Finn wanted to argue, to insist that human life was more valuable than abstract concepts of environmental balance. But sitting in that coffee shop, looking at her map with its red marks spreading like a disease across the Pacific Northwest, he found himself wondering if she might be right. That night, he and Morrison got drunk in a hotel room and made plans they both knew they'd never follow through on. They'd track the creature down, find some way to kill it or contain it, restore the natural order of things. But in the morning, with hangovers pounding behind their eyes and reality reasserting itself, they both knew they were kidding themselves. They were just two men with rifles and good intentions, facing something that had survived since before recorded history. Something that moved through the wilderness like a ghost, leaving only peaceful corpses and impossible tracks to mark its passage. Finn went back to his desk job. Morrison returned to his cabin outside Fairbanks. They stayed in touch for a while, sharing news articles about missing hikers and unexplained deaths. But gradually, the calls became less frequent. What was the point? They couldn't stop what was happening, couldn't even warn people without sounding like lunatics. The creature's hunting ground continued to expand. By the end of that year, similar disappearances were being reported in British Columbia, Oregon, and Northern California. Always the same pattern, experienced outdoors people vanishing from remote areas, their bodies found days or weeks later in poses of perfect serenity. The media occasionally picked up on the story, dubbing it the peaceful death phenomenon, and speculating about everything from serial killers to natural gas leaks that caused hallucinations. The truth was too outlandish for serious consideration, too dangerous for public consumption. But Finn knew what was really happening. Somewhere out there in the vast wilderness of North America, an ancient guardian was doing what it had always done, collecting those who ventured too far from civilization and guiding them gently into whatever comes after. The forest was taking back its own, one peaceful death at a time. And in quiet moments, usually late at night, when the wind sounds like breathing and shadows move with too much purpose, he found himself wondering, when his time came to die, would he choose the slow terror of a hospital bed, or the gentle mercy of sitting beneath a pine tree while something older than human understanding whispered him toward the next world? The woodsman was still out there, still hunting, still patient. The wilderness has many guardians, and they're all hungry for company. Some nights he thinks he hears it calling. Morrison died last winter. Heart attack, they said, very peaceful. They found him sitting on his porch, face turned toward the forest, expression serene as a sleeping child. The coroner noted unusual marks in the snow around his body, large, bipedal tracks arranged in a perfect circle. Finn is the only one left who knows what that means. And sometimes, on nights when the darkness presses close and the silence feels expectant, he finds himself putting on his boots and walking toward the tree line. Not because he wants to die, but because he's tired of running from the truth. The woodsman of Kanatack Lake has been very patient with him, but patience, even ancient patience, has its limits. When people read his story, he'll probably be gone. Don't come looking for him. Don't follow the tracks. The forest is hungry and it's time to feed.